A prominent billionaire CEO couldn't hide his disdain when his son introduced his new girlfriend, a successful black executive. Determined to end the relationship, he tried everything to separate them, including offering her money to leave. His world shattered when a DNA test revealed the shocking truth. She was his own daughter from a college relationship he never knew about. Now he must face his own prejudices and try to heal the wounds he created with his own flesh and blood. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The mahogany doors of Thorne Industries headquarters swung open, revealing Julian Thorne. His tailored suit, impeccably pressed, did little to soften the glacial hardness of his expression. He moved with the practiced grace of a predator, his gaze sweeping across the opulent lobby, a silent assessment of his kingdom. His son, Damon, stood nervously by the reception desk, a picture of youthful anxiety stark against his father's imposing figure. Damon's usually carefree smile was strained, replaced by a tight-lipped nervousness. The air crackled with unspoken tension. "He's here," Damon murmured, his voice barely audible above the low hum of the air conditioning. Julian didn't acknowledge his son's words, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. Ava, radiant in a tailored pantsuit, moved with a quiet confidence that belied the apprehension in her eyes. She carried herself with an inherent dignity, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate outwards, a stark contrast to Julian's cold demeanor. The scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and sandalwood, filled the air, a delicate counterpoint to the sterile scent of polished marble and expensive leather. As Ava approached, Julian's lips tightened. He offered a curt nod, his gaze lingering on her too long, a silent appraisal laced with undisguised disdain. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, a palpable tension hanging in the air thicker than the expensive mahogany scent of the lobby itself. Damon shifted uncomfortably, caught in the crossfire of his father's disapproval and Ava's quiet resilience. The first encounter was sealed in an atmosphere of simmering hostility, setting the stage for a conflict that would shatter more than just a relationship. The quiet hum of the elevator underscored the unspoken tension between Julian and Ava. The polished brass doors slid open, revealing Julian's opulent office, a breathtaking panorama of the city sprawling below. Ava, however, barely registered the view, her gaze fixed on Julian's back as he moved to his imposing desk, the leather creaking a subtle counterpoint to the city's symphony below. He didn't offer her a seat. "I assume you've considered my proposal," Julian said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. He didn't look at her, his fingers drumming a staccato rhythm on the polished wood. Ava's silence stretched, a silent testament to her inner turmoil. The scent of expensive coffee from his desk, usually a comforting aroma, only served to amplify the tension. She could feel the weight of his disdain pressing down on her, a suffocating presence in the vast room. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice calm but firm, betraying none of the tempest brewing inside. "Your offer was insulting. I don't value myself based on monetary figures." He finally turned, his eyes, cold, calculating, met hers. "Insulting? I offered you a considerable sum to distance yourself from my son. It was a generous gesture considering the circumstances." A muscle twitched in Ava's jaw. The city lights blurred slightly through her unshed tears. "The circumstances you created. It was not a gesture of generosity, Mr. Thorne, but an attempt to buy my silence, to manipulate a situation you find uncomfortable." Her voice rose slightly, the tremor betraying her carefully maintained composure. The subtle scent of her perfume, usually a comforting presence, felt suffocating now. Julian's expression remained unchanged, yet a flicker of something, perhaps surprise or a hint of unease, crossed his face. He saw in her eyes the unwavering strength he'd once admired in himself, a strength he'd buried under layers of success and arrogance. It was a disquieting reflection, a mirror to a part of himself he'd long forgotten. The silence returned, a heavy cloak woven from unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. The city lights, once a symbol of his empire, now felt like cold, indifferent witnesses to his unfolding downfall. The silence stretched, taut and heavy as a drawn bowstring. Ava's controlled fury felt like a physical presence in the room, a stark contrast to the opulent calm Julian had meticulously cultivated. The city lights, glittering like fallen stars outside his window, seemed to mock his carefully constructed world. He'd underestimated her, a realization that pricked at his carefully constructed composure. The expensive leather of his chair suddenly felt too tight, too confining. He shifted, a subtle movement that spoke volumes. I apologize," he began, the words clumsy and unfamiliar on his tongue. The apology felt inadequate, pathetic even, in the face of her unwavering gaze. He saw the hurt in her eyes, a deep wound that his money couldn't buy. Ava's silence was a dam holding back a torrent of emotion. She looked away, her gaze settling on a small, almost insignificant painting on the wall. A vibrant splash of color in this monochrome scene of power and wealth. The air crackled with unshed tears and suppressed anger. The scent of her perfume, a subtle floral blend, now seemed laced with the bitter tang of betrayal. Damon's arrival was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. He stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of apprehension and controlled rage. He had overheard the final, brutal exchange. His presence, a silent force, shifted the focus. The city lights, blurred through the glass, seemed less like glittering jewels and more like distant, cold stars. "Father," Damon said, his voice low and strained. The word felt heavy with unspoken accusations and years of suppressed resentment. He moved towards Ava, a silent gesture of support that spoke louder than any words. He put a comforting hand on her shoulder. Julian watched, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. The city below seemed to shrink, its grandeur dwarfed by the enormity of his mistake. The opulent office, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage. The hum of the city outside was now a symphony of his own failures, playing on repeat in his mind. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, revealing the insecure man he had always been beneath the veneer of success. He was stripped bare, exposed, and his carefully built empire felt brittle and transient. His world, his carefully crafted life, was about to change forever. The silence hung heavy, thick with the unspoken accusations swirling between Julian, Ava, and Damon. The city lights, usually a mesmerizing backdrop to Julian's opulent office, now felt like cold, indifferent witnesses to his failure. The scent of expensive leather and Ava's subtle floral perfume battled for dominance in the air, a strange olfactory representation of the clashing worlds they inhabited. Ava finally spoke, her voice low and controlled, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within her. "Your apology is as hollow as the promises you made," she said, her gaze fixed on the insignificant painting, its vibrant colors a jarring counterpoint to the gray despair settling over her. Each word was precise, each syllable carrying the weight of hurt and betrayal. The diamond studs in her ears glittered, reflecting the harsh light, mirroring the cold gleam in her eyes. Damon, his hand resting protectively on Ava's shoulder, stepped forward. "She's right, Father," he said, his voice strained with a mixture of anger and sadness. "This isn't about money. It's about respect, about decency. You treated her like she was less than." He paused, choosing his words carefully, his jaw tight with controlled fury. The muted hum of the city outside seemed to amplify the tension in the room, a low thrumming underscore to their unspoken conflict. Julian watched them, a wave of nausea washing over him. The polished mahogany desk, usually a symbol of his power, suddenly felt like a cold, unforgiving slab of wood. His carefully constructed world, built on ambition and wealth, felt like a house of cards, teetering on the brink of collapse. The weight of his actions, the sheer depth of his prejudice, pressed down on him with crushing force. He'd never truly seen Ava, not really. He'd only seen a threat, an obstacle to his son's happiness, a woman he could easily dismiss with a careless gesture and a wad of cash. He was wrong, devastatingly, irrevocably wrong. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The city lights outside flickered momentarily, as if mirroring the unsteady flickering of his own resolve. He was a man accustomed to control, to having his way, yet here he was, stripped bare, exposed in the harsh light of his own failings. The silence stretched again, broken only by the distant siren of an ambulance, a mournful counterpoint to the personal tragedy unfolding in his opulent office. He needed to fix this, not for his reputation, not for his empire, but for the woman he had so carelessly hurt. The path to redemption felt daunting, treacherous. Yet for the first time in a long time, Julian Thorne felt a glimmer of hope. The city, though still indifferent, seemed a little less cold. The mahogany desk felt cold against Julian's palms, the polished surface a stark contrast to the burning shame in his chest. Ava's words, precise and cutting, echoed in the cavernous silence of his office. He watched her, the diamond studs in her ears catching the city's glittering reflection, a painful reminder of the wealth he'd so carelessly wielded as a weapon. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her strength, blinded by his own ingrained prejudices. Damon's quiet fury was almost more painful than Ava's controlled anger. The protective hand resting on Ava's shoulder spoke volumes, a silent declaration of unwavering support that cut Julian to the core. He'd pushed his son away, too, blinded by his own arrogance. The city lights, normally a reassuring spectacle of his power, felt invasive, their glare highlighting the hollowness in his success. The faint scent of expensive cigars, a usual comfort, now felt suffocating, a reminder of his opulent world that had failed him. A low hum, like the distant thrum of a restless beast, emanated from the city below, mirroring the turmoil within him. I didn't know," Julian finally managed, his voice a strained whisper barely audible above the city's low murmur. The words felt inadequate, pathetic, a feeble attempt to excuse the inexcusable. He saw the skepticism etched on Ava's face, the subtle tightening of Damon's jaw. His explanations, even if heartfelt, would likely ring hollow. He knew that. Ava turned away, her shoulders slumping slightly. The movement, small as it was, spoke of a profound exhaustion, a weariness born of repeated betrayals. The quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout his insults now seemed fragile, barely clinging on. Damon, sensing the shift in Ava's demeanor, gently squeezed her shoulder. "Let's go, Ava," he said softly, his voice laced with concern. His gaze, however, lingered on his father, a mixture of disappointment and something akin to pity in his eyes. As Ava and Damon left, the city lights seemed to dim, their brilliance fading into a muted gray. Julian was alone, the vast expanse of his office suddenly feeling overwhelmingly empty. The weight of his actions, the crushing reality of his prejudice, settled upon him like a physical burden. He had to make amends, not for his reputation, not for the sake of his empire, but for the woman he'd unwittingly hurt, the daughter he'd never known. The path ahead was treacherous, he knew, but the faint flicker of hope, the nascent spark of redemption, burned brighter now, a tiny flame against the vast darkness of his regret. He had to find a way to reach her, to show her the truth he himself had only just begun to accept. The elevator ride down was a silent testament to the chasm that had opened between father and son. Damon's jaw remained clenched, his knuckles white around the strap of his briefcase. The polished chrome walls reflected the strained set of his features, mirroring the turmoil within Julian. The air, usually scented with the faint aroma of expensive cologne, now felt thick with unspoken accusations. Julian cleared his throat, the sound brittle and unconvincing. "Damon," he began, his voice barely a whisper above the hum of the descending car. Damon didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the closing doors of the elevator. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, punctuated only by the rhythmic chime announcing each floor. Reaching the lobby, Damon paused, his hand hovering over the door handle. I need some time," he finally said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. The words hung in the air, sharp and definitive. Julian reached out, his hand falling short of his son's shoulder. The gesture, half-hearted and hesitant, spoke volumes about the distance that had grown between them. "I understand," he murmured, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with suffocating force. He felt the cold bite of regret, a sharp, persistent pain that echoed the emptiness in his lavishly appointed office. The city lights, usually a symbol of his triumphs, now seemed to mock him, their brilliance devoid of warmth. The scent of expensive cigars, his constant companion, now felt suffocating, a bitter reminder of the opulent world that had failed to fill the void within him. He watched Damon walk away, the figure swallowed by the bustling lobby, leaving Julian stranded in the silence, his power, his wealth, suddenly meaningless. The seed of doubt, planted earlier, had begun to sprout, its roots twisting deep into the fertile ground of his guilt. He had to find a way to mend the shattered pieces, to repair the damage he'd inflicted, not just on Ava, but on his own son. The path ahead was arduous, filled with obstacles he'd himself created. But the faintest glimmer of hope, a fragile ember of redemption, burned within him, fueling his determination to confront the truth and its painful consequences. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Julian's power, felt cold and alien beneath his fingertips. The city lights, blurred through the rain-streaked windows, seemed to mock his solitude. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking a mournful counterpoint to the silence. He hadn't touched the expensive scotch since Damon had left, the sharp, biting taste now replaced by a bitter residue of regret. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning shame in his chest. Ava's number stared back at him, a silent accusation. He hesitated, the simple act of dialing fraught with 1,000 anxieties. He imagined her voice, sharp and unforgiving, echoing the rejection he'd so richly deserved. Finally, he dialed. The ringing tone felt like a hammer blow against his already frayed nerves. 3 rings. 4. He almost hung up, the cowardice a bitter taste on his tongue. "Hello." Ava's voice, though measured, held an unmistakable edge of frost. "Ava," he began, his voice a shaky whisper. He cleared his throat, the sound grating in the suffocating silence of his office. "It's Julian." A beat of silence, pregnant with unspoken accusations. Then, a quiet, chilling response. "I have nothing to say to you." The line went dead, leaving Julian staring at the disconnected call, the weight of his actions crushing him beneath their immense weight. The city lights outside flickered, mirroring the dying embers of hope within him. He needed a different approach, a way to break through the icy wall she'd erected around her heart. He needed to find a way to make her understand. The path to redemption was fraught with challenges, but the seed of guilt, now a thriving plant, fueled his determination to atone. His wealth and power felt suddenly insignificant, replaced by a profound sense of his own inadequacy and the urgent need to make amends. The next morning, sunlight sliced through the blinds, painting stripes across Julian's expansive office. He sat, hunched over his desk, the remnants of last night's scotch still clinging to the air, a bitter perfume of regret. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his fingers on the polished wood. He reread Ava's curt rejection, the words burning into his eyes like acid. He needed a different strategy, one that didn't reek of his usual arrogance. He considered calling Damon, but the image of his son's furious face flashed in his mind, a painful reminder of his failure as a father. Instead, he picked up a framed photograph, a casual snapshot of Damon and Ava laughing at a family barbecue. Ava's smile, radiant and genuine, pierced him with a fresh wave of guilt. It was a smile he'd almost deliberately extinguished. The phone buzzed. It was his assistant, reminding him of a charity gala that evening. Usually, such events were mere social obligations, but tonight, the prospect of mingling among the city's elite felt suffocating. He considered canceling, but a new thought took hold. Perhaps he could run into Ava there. It was a long shot, but it was a start. He spent the afternoon meticulously planning his approach, choosing an outfit with agonizing care, rejecting several suits before settling on one that projected a softer, more approachable image. He practiced his apology in the mirror, his voice wavering at first, then gaining a shaky strength. At the gala, the air crackled with the buzz of conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes. Julian scanned the crowd, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Then he saw her. Ava stood alone near a balcony, silhouetted against the city lights. She was impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of quiet strength that both captivated and intimidated him. He approached cautiously, his steps measured, his breath catching in his throat. "Ava," he began, his voice barely a whisper above the murmuring crowd. She turned, her gaze cool and distant. The silence stretched, heavy and charged with unspoken accusations. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured and controlled. "I wasn't expecting to see you here, Julian." The subtle tremor in her voice revealed the depth of her hurt, a vulnerability that tugged at his conscience. He knew he had to tread carefully, to avoid the condescending tone that had poisoned their previous interactions. "I know," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. "And I'm sorry for everything." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "I was wrong, horribly, devastatingly wrong." The city lights shimmered behind her, reflecting in her eyes, creating a landscape of conflicting emotions. He waited, bracing himself for her response, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, a heavy burden he finally understood he had to carry. The mahogany of Julian's study felt cold beneath his fingertips. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. He stared at Ava's rejection, the crisp, elegant script a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within him. He'd underestimated her, her quiet dignity, the unwavering strength he'd initially dismissed as arrogance, now felt like a mirror reflecting his own failings. He tried to buy her off, a pathetic attempt to control a situation he couldn't comprehend. The memory of her glacial stare, the hurt etched into her beautiful face, haunted him. Damon's enraged accusations echoed in his ears. His son, usually so reserved, had unleashed a torrent of fury, shattering the carefully constructed facade of their relationship. Julian had lost more than just a potential daughter-in-law. He'd lost his son's trust. The city outside his window was a blur of lights, a silent witness to his self-inflicted misery. He reached for the scotch, then hesitated. The liquor offered only temporary oblivion, a deceptive escape from the harsh reality he needed to confront. Instead, he picked up a worn photograph, a picture of his college self, radiating an arrogance he now recognized as youthful ignorance. Beside him, a vibrant young woman smiled, her eyes sparkling with a mischievous intelligence. A fleeting image of a shared laugh, a stolen kiss, a summer romance abruptly cut short. A resemblance, too uncanny to ignore, with Ava's own smile. Doubt, insidious and cold, began to slither into his heart. He was losing the battle against his own conscience. The phone rang, a jarring sound in the oppressive silence. It was his lawyer. The DNA results were ready. The lawyer's voice, clipped and professional, announced the results. Julian's breath hitched. The mahogany desk felt slick beneath his trembling hands. He could taste the metallic tang of fear, a bitter aftertaste to the expensive scotch he downed in a desperate attempt at self-medication. "The DNA confirms a biological link," the lawyer stated, his tone devoid of emotion. A link. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A biological link to Ava. His Ava, the woman he'd tried to buy off. The city lights outside blurred through his tears. The sharp scent of rain mingled with the stale aroma of his regret. Each drop of rain felt like a tiny hammer blow against the edifice of his self-deception. He saw her face again, clear as day. The quiet dignity, the wounded pride, the simmering anger masked by a controlled composure. He'd mistaken her strength for arrogance, her resilience for defiance. It was his arrogance, his ingrained prejudice, that had blinded him. A choked sob escaped his lips, The photograph of his youthful self, the laughing girl beside him, was suddenly unbearably poignant. Her smile so like Ava's, the guilt was a physical weight crushing him. His success, his empire, his carefully cultivated image, all felt meaningless, hollow shells against the crushing weight of his realization. He judged her, condemned her, without knowing the truth. He'd driven a wedge between himself and his own daughter, his own flesh and blood. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the polished floor. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window panes. He closed his eyes, the image of Ava's face searing itself onto his eyelids. He needed to make amends, to right the wrongs he had committed. But how could he even begin to repair the damage he'd inflicted? The monumental task before him felt insurmountable. The weight of his actions, of his prejudice, pressed down on him with agonizing force, threatening to drown him in the sea of his own making. He had a lot of explaining to do. He had a daughter to find, and a son's trust to regain. The rain hammered against the penthouse windows, mirroring the storm raging inside Julian. He stared at the DNA report, the stark black lettering a cruel mockery of his carefully constructed life. His expensive scotch, usually a bomb, tasted like ash. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the strands slick with sweat and despair. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of his power, felt cold and unforgiving. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling. He needed to talk to Damon, to explain, to apologize. The word felt alien, clumsy on his tongue. He dialed his son's number, the ring echoing the emptiness in his soul. "Dad." Damon's voice, usually warm and easy, was tight with suspicion. "What's going on? It's late." "Damon, I need to see you," Julian managed, his voice hoarse. "It's about Ava." The silence stretched, taut and unbearable. "What about her?" Damon's tone hardened. "Did you try something else? Because if you—" "No, son, listen to me," Julian interrupted, his voice breaking. I need to tell you something about Ava. Something that will change everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Damon remained silent, the quiet more damning than any outburst. Julian imagined Ava, her face etched with the hurt he'd inflicted, and a fresh wave of nausea washed over him. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering tapestry of indifference to his internal turmoil. His empire, his success, felt like worthless trinkets in the face of this devastating truth. He had to atone. He had to begin to undo the damage he'd wrought. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of guilt and regret. He needed to find Ava. He needed to beg for forgiveness. But how do you beg forgiveness from the daughter you'd unknowingly tried to buy? The following morning, Julian awoke to the gnawing emptiness that had settled in his gut. Sunlight, usually a symbol of his unyielding power, felt harsh and intrusive. The opulent penthouse suite, usually a sanctuary, felt like a gilded cage. He pushed himself out of bed, the silk sheets cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the burning shame within. He needed coffee, strong and black, something to cut through the clinging fog of self-loathing. He descended the spiraling staircase, the polished mahogany gleaming under the morning light. The city spread before him, a vast, indifferent expanse. He saw it now not as a testament to his success, but as a silent witness to his failure. He poured himself a cup, the dark liquid doing little to soothe the turmoil within. His phone buzzed. It was Damon. He hesitated, the simple act of answering the call feeling monumental. "Dad." Damon's voice was strained, devoid of its usual warmth. I need to talk to you." Julian's throat tightened. "I know, son. I was just about to call you." There was a pause, a heavy silence filled with unspoken accusations and anxieties. "I saw Ava," Damon finally said, his voice low and tense. "She's devastated. She won't talk about what you did, just that she's hurt." "I understand," Julian replied, his voice barely a whisper. The words felt inadequate, hollow in the face of the destruction he'd caused. He could almost feel the weight of Ava's pain, a physical burden pressing down on him. He closed his eyes, the image of her face, usually bright and full of life, now clouded with hurt, sharp and distinct in his mind. "I need to see her," Julian said, his voice gaining a slight tremor of resolve. "I need to explain, to apologize." "I don't think that's a good idea right now, Dad," Damon countered, his voice laced with apprehension. "She needs space, time to heal." Julian knew Damon was right, yet the need to face his daughter, to plead for her understanding, consumed him. He had to try. He had to begin the long, arduous journey towards redemption. The journey, he realized with a heavy sigh, would begin with a sincere and heartfelt apology. The first step on a path fraught with uncertainty but vital to his own healing and peace. His own selfish ambition had nearly destroyed the most valuable thing in his life. He had to fight for what he had left. The mahogany table in Julian's study felt cold beneath his fingertips as he reread the check. The zeros swam before his eyes, mocking him. $5 million. A sum that could buy countless luxuries, yet felt utterly worthless in the face of Ava's quiet, unwavering dignity. He'd envisioned her accepting, relieved, grateful even. Instead, her eyes had burned with a cold fire, her voice laced with contempt. The memory stung, a fresh wound on top of the festering guilt. He poured himself another brandy, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the raw ache in his chest. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting dancing shadows on the portraits lining the walls, a testament to his success, a gallery of his failures. Each painting seemed to whisper of his arrogance, his blindness. His phone buzzed, the jarring sound cutting through the suffocating silence. He flinched, almost dropping the glass. It was Damon. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the answer button, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He finally answered, his voice a rough whisper. "Dad." Damon's voice was tight, strained with barely controlled fury. She's leaving." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. Leaving? Leaving the city? He felt a cold dread creeping into his bones. His carefully constructed world, built on power and control, was crumbling. "No," Damon said, his voice low. "Leaving me," she said. "She said she can't be with someone whose father would try to buy her off." A long pause followed, filled with the unspoken accusations hanging heavy between them. I know," Julian managed, his voice choked with remorse. The opulent room, usually a sanctuary of comfort, felt claustrophobic, the air thick with the unspoken. He imagined Ava, her face etched with pain, packing her belongings, each item a silent testament to his destructive actions. The brandy in his hand felt suddenly heavy, the taste acrid. "I acted like a fool, Damon. A heartless fool." "More than a fool, Dad," Damon said, his voice barely audible. "You humiliated her. You humiliated us." The accusation cut deep, a sharp stab to the already wounded heart. Julian closed his eyes, the image of Ava's face, the hurt and betrayal mirrored in her eyes, seared into his memory. He had to make this right. He had to find a way to mend the shattered pieces of his own creation. The journey would be arduous, long, and filled with uncertainty. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised even himself, that he had to try. The city lights blurred through Ava's taxi window, a shimmering, indifferent backdrop to the turmoil within her. Each passing street lamp cast a fleeting, harsh glow on her face, highlighting the unshed tears welling in her eyes. Damon's words echoed in her ears, a desperate plea, a fragile hope shattered by Julian Thorne's callous act. $5 million. The sheer audacity of the offer, the utter lack of respect, it still burned. She felt a hollow ache in her chest, a physical manifestation of the betrayal. It wasn't just the money. It was the blatant disregard for her intelligence, her accomplishments, her very self. It was the chilling realization that a man of Julian Thorne's stature, a man who commanded respect and admiration, could descend to such crass manipulation. The icy disdain in his eyes still haunted her. Reaching her apartment, She fumbled with her keys, the metal cold against her trembling fingers. The silence inside was deafening, amplifying the storm raging within. She sank onto the sofa, the plush fabric offering no comfort. The expensive apartment, a testament to her hard-earned success, suddenly felt suffocating, a gilded cage of loneliness. Her phone buzzed. It was Damon again. Hesitantly, she answered. His voice, muffled with emotion, broke through the silence. "Ava, I'm so sorry. My father—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his shame and anger. "I know," Ava whispered, her voice barely a breath. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations and a profound sense of disillusionment. She couldn't fathom a future with Damon, not when his father's shadow loomed so large, a constant reminder of his ingrained prejudice. "He doesn't see me, Damon. He only sees a problem to be solved." Silence stretched between them, a chasm of hurt and betrayal. The city lights flickered outside, mirroring the flickering hope in her heart. The weight of Julian Thorne's actions pressed down on her. $5 million couldn't buy her back the respect, the dignity, or the simple acknowledgement she deserved. The path ahead seemed daunting, uncertain, but one thing was clear. She couldn't compromise her self-worth for anyone, not even for Damon. The mahogany door of Julian Thorne's office, usually a symbol of his power, felt oppressive to Ava. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars clung to the air, a suffocating reminder of his wealth and the chasm separating them. She sat rigidly, the plush chair offering no comfort. Julian's silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Its measured beats mirrored the steady drum of anxiety in her chest. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and surprisingly devoid of its usual arrogance. "Ava, I offered you money." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his actions. Ava met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. $5 million to disappear. A rather insulting proposition." The bitterness in her voice was undeniable. She felt the sting of his rejection, the crushing weight of his prejudice, but she refused to let it break her. He shifted in his chair, a subtle tremor betraying his unease. I was wrong, terribly wrong. I let my preconceptions." He paused, searching for the right words, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. "Preconceptions that cost you a relationship with your daughter," she finished quietly, the words laced with a quiet, devastating power. The unspoken accusation hung between them, thick and heavy. The city lights outside blurred, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the profound disrespect, the subtle insults, the condescending remarks, the blatant attempts to control her life. They all pointed to a deep-seated prejudice that went far beyond her professional standing. He had judged her based on the color of her skin, reducing her accomplishments and her worth to nothing. The hurt was raw, visceral, an ache that extended beyond the immediate insult. She was not just an executive. She was a person, a daughter, a woman who deserved to be seen and respected, not purchased and dismissed. The pain she carried was not a minor grievance, but the full force of a lifetime of subtle and not so subtle prejudices being levied against her. And this was just the beginning. The silence in Julian's opulent office was a tangible thing, thick as the Persian rug beneath Ava's feet. The scent of expensive leather and mahogany seemed to mock her, a stark contrast to the raw hurt clawing at her insides. Outside, the city hummed with a vibrant energy she couldn't access, her world constricted to this suffocating space. Julian's apology, or rather, his attempt at one, felt hollow, a pathetic offering tossed from a great height. $5 million. The sheer audacity of it still burned. "It wasn't about the money, Mr. Thorne," Ava said, her voice low but steady, each word a carefully placed stone. "It was about the disrespect, the implication that my success, my existence, could be bought and sold." The cool steel of her gaze never wavered. She felt a tremor of anger, a defiant flame against the chilling indifference she had encountered. Julian flinched. The arrogance that usually cloaked him like a second skin seemed to peel away, revealing a flicker of something else. Fear? He ran a hand through his silver hair, the gesture betraying a profound unease. I didn't see you, Ava. I saw a threat. To Damon. To my world. His voice was a raspy whisper, the weight of his realization pressing down on him. Damon, who had been silently observing from a nearby chair, stood abruptly. Your world, he echoed, his voice sharp with anger. Your precious, fragile world that couldn't handle a strong, successful black woman? The accusation hung in the air, heavy and accusing. Julian looked from Damon, his son's face a mask of barely controlled fury, to Ava, whose eyes held a chilling mix of pain and disdain. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, the suffocating realization that his prejudice had nearly destroyed everything. The grandfather clock ticked relentlessly, each tick a hammer blow against his carefully constructed facade. He had lost something precious, something irreplaceable, and he had only himself to blame. The opulent office, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in the consequences of his actions. The city lights blurred through the window, mirroring the chaotic storm raging within him. The fallout hung heavy in the air, thick and acrid like the expensive cigars Julian Thorne usually enjoyed. Damon's anger, raw and unfiltered, vibrated in the silence following Ava's departure. He stood by the window, the city lights a blurry smear through his tears. The sharp scent of rain on hot asphalt drifted in, a stark contrast to the sterile, opulent scent of his father's office. Julian sat heavily in his leather chair, the usual confident posture replaced by a slump that spoke volumes. I messed up, Damon, Julian finally said, his voice hoarse, devoid of its usual commanding tone. The words felt inadequate, flimsy against the weight of his actions. Damon didn't turn. Messed up? You nearly destroyed her life, Dad. You humiliated her, offered her money like she was some streetwalker. His voice cracked, the raw emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Julian winced, the word echoing the sharp sting of his own guilt. He ran a hand over his face, the rough skin a testament to sleepless nights spent wrestling with his conscience. I didn't see her, he mumbled, the words catching in his throat. I saw a threat. To you, to everything I've built. And what you've built is crumbling, Dad, Damon retorted, his voice laced with a weary sadness. Your world is built on prejudice and arrogance. Ava saw past that, and you tried to buy her silence. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each beat a relentless reminder of time lost, of opportunities squandered. Julian watched his son, a man he barely recognized, his own reflection in the polished glass of the window. A flicker of fear, sharp and cold, pierced the haze of his guilt. He had alienated his son, and possibly lost the woman who was, well, the possibility, however terrifying, was beginning to form in his mind. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach, a precursor to the seismic shift that was about to shatter his carefully constructed reality. The city lights blurred, mirroring the chaotic storm brewing inside him, a storm far more destructive than any he had ever faced in his ruthless climb to the top. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the panoramic windows of Julian's penthouse apartment, mirroring the tempest raging within him. He poured himself another scotch, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the burning guilt. Damon's words echoed, each syllable a sharp shard of truth piercing his carefully constructed armor of success. He hadn't just alienated his son. He'd insulted, humiliated, and attempted to buy off a woman whose quiet strength and resilience were becoming increasingly unnerving. Days blurred into a haze of self-recrimination. He found himself replaying encounters with Ava, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to his own bluster. He recalled the subtle elegance of her movements, the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes, qualities he'd initially dismissed as mere professional polish. Now they haunted him, suggesting a depth he'd been too blind to see. One evening, while sifting through old photographs, a faded image caught his eye. A younger Julian, carefree and passionate, laughing with a woman whose face was partially obscured. A familiar silver locket, identical to one he'd seen Ava wear, hung around the woman's neck. The image was blurry, the details obscured by time, yet the jolt of recognition was undeniable. The knot of unease tightened, a cold dread squeezing the air from his lungs. The possibility, once a terrifying whisper, now roared in his ears. What if? The question burrowed deep, unsettling the foundations of his meticulously crafted life. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a chaotic jumble of fragmented memories and faces, culminating in Ava's hurt expression. Her eyes filled with a profound disappointment that cut him to the core. He woke each morning with a new layer of guilt, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The city, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a suffocating cage. He was trapped, not by his wealth, but by his own prejudices and the devastating consequences of his actions. The looming possibility of a life-altering revelation hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating, much like the guilt that now clung to him. He had to know. The thought, once abhorrent, now felt like a desperate plea for redemption. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's trembling hands. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, mirroring the confusion swirling in his mind. He reread Damon's furious email, the words a brutal indictment of his actions. "You humiliated her, Dad. You think money can fix everything?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the fiery guilt burning in his chest. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over Ava's contact. The simple act felt monumental, a chasm of his own making separating them. He imagined her face, the quiet dignity masking the hurt he'd inflicted. He hadn't just hurt her. He'd wounded a part of himself he'd long suppressed, a part that mirrored her strength and resilience. A memory surfaced, a fleeting image of a laughing woman, her dark hair tumbling around her shoulders, a silver locket catching the sunlight. The woman's face was indistinct, yet the feeling of profound connection was unmistakable. His gut clenched. The possibility, previously dismissed as absurd, now felt terrifyingly real. Ava, could she? He slammed the phone down, the sharp sound echoing in the vast emptiness of his apartment. He needed answers, needed to quell the growing dread that gnawed at his composure. He couldn't bear the uncertainty, the agonizing possibility that he'd not only alienated his son but also driven away his own daughter. The fear, raw and visceral, was a cold hand gripping his heart. The scotch, once a solace, now tasted like ash. He needed to know. He needed to know now. The rain intensified, and with a shudder, he knew he had to act. The following morning, the city's relentless hum felt amplified, a discordant symphony mirroring the turmoil in Julian's soul. He stared at the rain-lashed cityscape from his penthouse, the gray mirroring the ashen taste in his mouth. Damon's accusation echoed, a relentless hammer against the fragile walls of his composure. He hadn't slept, the image of the laughing woman with the silver locket a persistent, haunting presence. He reached for the phone again, the cool glass a stark contrast to the feverish heat building within him. He dialed Ava's number, his thumb trembling. It rang, each chime a small, agonizing hammer blow. When she answered, her voice was cool, distant. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. The formality felt like a wall, impenetrable and chilling. "Ava," he began, his voice a strained whisper. I need to talk to you." "There's nothing to say, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice tight with unshed tears. "Your apology, your pathetic attempt at an apology, is hardly sufficient for the humiliation you've inflicted." A sharp intake of breath punctuated her words, a silent testament to the pain she concealed. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Julian felt the weight of his actions crush him. He'd underestimated the depth of her strength, her resilience, and the immeasurable hurt he'd caused. "I understand," he mumbled, his voice thick with remorse. "But I need you to know. There's something I need to tell you." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. The possibility of what he was about to reveal was a terrifying precipice, a chasm of his own creation. "I don't care what you have to say, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice edged with bitterness. "Goodbye." The line went dead, leaving Julian with the gnawing emptiness of his own making. He slumped back into his chair, the city lights blurring into a meaningless spectacle. The rain continued its relentless assault, mirroring the storm raging within him. The need for answers, for a resolution, was overwhelming. He had to know. He had to act, and soon. The weight of his potential truth was almost unbearable. He picked up his phone again, this time dialing a different number, a private investigator he'd already contacted. He needed the test results, and he needed them now. The city's relentless rhythm outside seemed to pulse with the urgency of his own desperate heart. The mahogany desk felt cold against Julian's palms. He stared at the rain-streaked windows of his office, the city a blurry canvas of gray and black. The scent of old leather and expensive coffee did nothing to soothe the churning anxiety in his gut. Ava's rejection echoed, a sharp, icy shard lodged in his heart. He rubbed his temples, the pressure building behind his eyes. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her strength, her quiet dignity, blinded by his own ingrained prejudices. A half-empty glass of scotch sat on his desk, a testament to the sleepless night. He hadn't eaten, hadn't even noticed the gnawing hunger. His mind replayed their conversation, Ava's voice a chilling echo of his own failings. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, a pain he'd inflicted. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, stealing his breath. He picked up a framed photograph, Damon as a boy, grinning broadly, his arm around a young woman with warm brown eyes and a radiant smile. The woman bore an uncanny resemblance to Ava. A jolt of recognition, a flicker of unsettling familiarity, ran through him. It was a fleeting sensation, quickly dismissed, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The memory of a passionate college romance, a fleeting encounter years ago, surfaced, hazy yet insistent. A woman with a silver locket, a locket identical to the one Ava always wore. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture revealing his turmoil. The city outside seemed to hold its breath, mirroring his own desperate need for answers. The DNA test was his only hope, a desperate attempt to grasp at some semblance of redemption, to understand the inexplicable pull he felt towards Ava. The results were due tomorrow. The wait was agonizing. He needed to know. He needed to know the truth, however painful it might be. His future, his very soul, seemed to hang in the balance. The rain hammered against the panoramic windows of Julian's penthouse apartment, mirroring the tempest raging within him. He paced, the plush carpet yielding silently under his expensive loafers. The city lights blurred through the downpour, a shimmering, indistinct backdrop to his internal turmoil. He hadn't slept. The image of Ava's face, etched with a mixture of hurt and defiance, burned into his memory. He poured another scotch, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass, a pathetic attempt to drown the rising tide of guilt. He stopped pacing, staring at the photograph again. Damon, young and carefree, with his arm around a woman whose smile held a haunting familiarity. The resemblance to Ava was uncanny, a detail he'd dismissed earlier as mere coincidence. Now it felt like a damning piece of evidence, a cruel joke played by fate. He ran his fingers over the woman's face in the photograph, a gesture both gentle and desperate. He remembered the silver locket, a fleeting image from a hazy past, a detail that had surfaced amidst the turmoil of his recent encounter with Ava, a locket identical to the one she always wore. The phone rang, jarring him from his reverie. He snatched it up, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," a crisp, professional voice. "The results of the DNA test are ready." Julian's breath hitched. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread and a flicker of desperate hope. He felt a cold sweat prickling his skin. His hand trembled as he clutched the phone, his knuckles white. "Yes," he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "I'm ready." The silence that followed felt like an eternity, stretched taut with anticipation. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the glass, a rhythmic counterpoint to the pounding of his heart. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the truth, whatever it may be. The truth that could shatter his meticulously constructed world, or perhaps offer him a chance at redemption. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden he'd carried for far too long. This call, this moment, held the key to his future, and perhaps a chance to heal the wounds he'd inflicted. He waited, suspended between fear and hope, a captive of his own making. The voice on the other end was calm, almost clinical, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Julian. "Mr. Thorne, the results are positive." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Julian felt a strange lightness. A dizzying release followed instantly by a crushing weight of guilt. He sank onto a plush armchair, the expensive leather doing little to cushion the blow. The rain continued its relentless assault on the city, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the glass, mirroring the frantic rhythm of his heart. He stared at the swirling amber liquid in his glass, the scotch now tasting like ash. He'd built his empire on calculated risks, but this was different. This was a gamble with his soul. He thought of Ava's face, strong and defiant, yet vulnerable, etched with the pain he'd inflicted. The thought of her as his daughter, a secret buried under layers of arrogance and prejudice, sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. He saw himself young and reckless, selfish and cruel. He needed to see her to understand what this revelation meant for them, for Damon. But how could he possibly face her? How could he explain the years of disdain, the hurtful attempts to sabotage her happiness? How could he ever hope to earn her forgiveness? The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, a chaotic jumble of colors, reflecting the turmoil in his soul. He closed his eyes, the image of Ava's face superimposed over the memory of a younger woman, laughing, carefree, the silver locket gleaming around her neck. The locket, he'd almost forgotten. It was the same locket. His phone vibrated, a message from Damon. "Dad, I saw the news story about Ava. We need to talk." The words hung like a judgment. The weight of his actions, his prejudice, his complete and utter failure as a father pressed down on him. Redemption seemed a distant, impossible dream, but the message from his son, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the storm, stirred something within him, a fragile ember of resolve. He had to try. He had to face his daughter, his creation, his own flesh and blood. He had to try to fix what he had broken. The rain lashed against the panoramic windows of Julian's penthouse, mirroring the tempest in his soul. He replayed the doctor's words, a chilling echo in the opulent silence. Positive. The scotch burned, a bitter liquid mirroring the acrid taste of his regret. He swirled the amber liquid, watching the reflections distort, fracture, just like his carefully constructed life. He thought of Ava, her strength a stark contrast to his own crumbling facade. Her laughter, sharp and bright, now a haunting memory, overlaid with the crushing weight of his guilt. He remembered her eyes, intelligent and piercing, holding a quiet dignity that had both intimidated and fascinated him. He'd dismissed it as arrogance, a protective shield. Now he saw it as resilience, a mirror reflecting his own buried strength. A soft knock at the door broke the suffocating silence. Damon stood in the doorway, his face etched with a mixture of anger and concern. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. "Dad," Damon began, his voice low and strained, "I saw the article about Ava, about the DNA test." Julian nodded, unable to speak. The words caught in his throat like a stone. He gestured to the chair opposite him, the plush leather a stark reminder of his opulent detachment from the reality of his actions. Damon sat, his gaze unwavering. "What are you going to do?" The question hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken pain. Julian looked out at the city, a sprawling labyrinth of light and shadow, a reflection of the complexities within himself. He saw the years of his mistakes, his prejudices, his deliberate cruelty, crystallized into a single, devastating truth. I don't know, Julian finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper, a confession born of despair and a flicker of nascent hope. But I have to try. I have to try to fix this. The words felt inadequate, pathetic, even against the enormity of his transgression. Yet, they were a beginning, a fragile seed of redemption planted in the fertile ground of his remorse. The rain continued its relentless assault, but now, Julian felt a different kind of dampness, the first tears of genuine sorrow threatening to spill over. He was far from fixed, yet the journey had begun. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's trembling hands. The rain hammered against the glass, a relentless rhythm echoing the turmoil within him. He stared at a faded photograph, unearthed from a dusty box, a younger, carefree Julian, arm in arm with a woman whose smile mirrored Ava's. The woman's face was partially obscured, yet the curve of her jaw, the tilt of her head, a chilling resemblance. The memory, initially a fleeting image, solidified. It was at a university art exhibition. He remembered the vibrant colors, the hushed conversations, the scent of old books and linseed oil. He'd been captivated by her intensity, her fierce intelligence, a passionate connection, swiftly buried beneath ambition and a careless disregard. The phone rang, jarring him back to the present. He hesitated, the metallic chill of the receiver a stark contrast to the warmth of the memory. It was Damon. Dad. Damon's voice was tight, strained with suppressed anger. I need to see you. Now. Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his guilt. I'm coming. The drive felt interminable. Each red light felt like a judgment, each passing car a silent accusation. He reached Damon's apartment, the familiar scent of coffee and old vinyl records doing little to soothe the storm within him. Damon was pacing, his agitation palpable. The air crackled with unshed tears and simmering resentment. I saw her, Damon said, his voice raw, at the gallery opening. She looked broken. Julian felt a fresh wave of nausea. He'd seen the article, the whispers, the damage he'd inflicted. He opened his mouth to speak, but Damon cut him off. You offered her money, Dad. Money, like she's some commodity. Damon's voice cracked. He stopped pacing, his fists clenched at his sides. She's not. She's incredible, and she's my girlfriend. But you treated her like dirt. Julian could only manage a weak nod, the weight of his actions crushing him. He wanted to explain, to apologize, but the words failed him. The photograph, a silent witness to his past, felt heavier than any burden. The rain outside intensified, mirroring the deluge of regret that threatened to consume him. He looked at Damon, his son, a mirror to his own mistakes, his own potential for redemption. The journey towards reconciliation had begun, a tortuous climb up a mountain of self-inflicted wounds. Yet the first step, however small, had been taken. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the rich mahogany of Julian's study. He paced, the Persian rug a soft, silent witness to his agitation. The DNA results lay on his desk, a stark white envelope, its contents threatening to unravel his carefully constructed life. He hadn't slept properly in days, haunted by fragmented memories. A flash of vibrant auburn hair, a laugh that echoed Ava's, a shared stolen kiss beneath a weeping willow tree. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling. He dialed Damon's number, the ringing a shrill counterpoint to the chaotic storm raging inside him. Damon, he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. We need to talk. About Ava. Damon's response was immediate, laced with suspicion. What about her? Julian hesitated, the words catching in his throat. I need to tell you something. Something important. He felt the weight of his past crushing him, the years of denial and prejudice threatening to suffocate him. He needed to confess, to lay bare the truth that threatened to shatter everything. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Julian could practically hear Damon's apprehension, the guarded silence a testament to the deep chasm that had opened between them. "Just tell me," Damon finally said, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "Tell me what's going on." The weight of his unspoken confession pressed down on Julian. He could feel the sweat beating on his forehead, the cold dread settling deep in his bones. The words, "I think Ava is my daughter," felt too immense, too horrifying to utter. He knew this revelation would not only change his relationship with his son, but irrevocably alter the course of his life. He had to find a way to say it, to begin to make amends for his own catastrophic mistakes. The journey to redemption was just beginning, and the road ahead looked long and arduous. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's trembling hands. He stared at the DNA results, the crisp white paper mocking his turmoil. The sterile scent of his study, usually a comfort, now felt suffocating. Outside, the city hummed, a relentless drone contrasting with the suffocating silence within. He pictured Ava, her vibrant spirit, her quiet strength, a mirror image of a woman he had loved and lost, a ghost that haunted his present. The memory, sharp and sudden, slammed into him. Auburn hair catching the sunlight, a shared laugh echoing in the college quad. He'd pushed it down for years, buried beneath layers of wealth and self-deception. Now it clawed its way back, sharp and raw. He picked up the phone, the smooth, cool surface a stark contrast to the sweat slicking his palms. He dialed Damon's number, each ring a hammer blow against his already frayed nerves. "Damon," he began, his voice a strained whisper, barely audible over the pounding in his ears. "It's about Ava. We need to talk." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that stretched between them. A chasm carved by years of unspoken resentments and escalating conflict. Julian could almost taste the bitterness hanging in the air. "What about her?" Damon finally responded, his voice tight with suspicion, each word clipped and sharp. The accusation was implicit. "What have you done now?" Julian swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The truth felt like a lead weight in his chest. He had to say it, even if the words threatened to shatter everything he had built. I think Ava is my daughter." The silence returned, deeper this time, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Each tick a reminder of time lost, of chances missed, of a life irrevocably altered. Julian held his breath, the weight of his confession pressing down on him, a physical burden. His own unspoken words felt as heavy as the years of self-deception that had brought him to this devastating precipice. He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, for Damon's reaction. The future felt uncertain, but one thing was clear. His life, and the lives of those he loved most, were about to be irrevocably changed. The chance encounter happened at a charity gala. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of champagne flutes, the plush velvet of the chairs, all faded into insignificance as Julian's gaze locked onto a woman across the room. She was talking animatedly, her laughter a bright, melodic sound that tugged at something deep within him. It wasn't just her resemblance to Ava, the same sharp intelligence in her eyes, the same way her smile crinkled the corners. It was something more profound. The way she held herself, the confident tilt of her head, a certain fiery independence. It stirred a memory, hazy at first, then sharpening with painful clarity. Auburn hair catching the city lights, a shared cigarette, the scent of rain on warm skin. The woman, a renowned architect, bore a striking resemblance to a woman he'd known briefly, passionately in college. A woman he'd never forgotten, yet actively buried from his consciousness. The memory brought with it a surge of guilt, a cold dread gripping his chest. He felt a tremor of fear, a premonition of something shattering. He watched the woman, her every movement, her every word, analyzing her, searching for more confirmation. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the elegant backdrop of the gala. He excused himself, the champagne glass suddenly heavy in his hand. The cool crystal felt like ice against his sweating palm. The opulent ballroom faded as he retreated into the shadowed hallway, the sudden quiet amplifying the chaos within him. He pulled out his phone, his fingers clumsy and numb. He needed to know. He needed confirmation. And the confirmation, he knew, would alter his life forever. The question wasn't if, but how he would face the truth that was already beginning to dawn on him with a sickening clarity. The sterile white walls of the clinic felt colder than the December night outside. Julian sat, the polished mahogany of the waiting room chair offering little comfort. His expensive suit, usually a symbol of power, felt like a suffocating weight. He checked his watch, the second hand a mocking reminder of time's relentless march. The air hung heavy with the scent of antiseptic and a nervous sweat slicked his palms. He hadn't slept properly in days, haunted by the architect's face, the echo of that long-ago laughter. Doubt, a gnawing beast, had taken root, twisting his certainty into a knot of fear and anticipation. He replayed the gala encounter, the woman's face a ghostly overlay on Ava's, the similarities striking, unsettling. His phone vibrated, the ringtone jarring in the silence. He glanced at the screen, the clinic. His heart lurched, a trapped bird beating against his ribs. He stood, legs unsteady, and walked towards the receptionist, his steps echoing in the hushed corridor. The nurse called his name, her voice devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. He followed her, his steps heavy, each footfall a beat of a death knell to his carefully constructed world. The doctor's calm, measured tones were lost on him. He only saw the file, the innocuous-looking folder containing the results, its simple exterior masking the potential seismic shift within. He opened it, his hands trembling. The words blurred through his tear-filled eyes, a mixture of relief and horror flooding his senses. The truth, stark and undeniable, stared back at him. His breath hitched in his throat. He was looking at his own life irrevocably altered. The weight of his actions, his prejudices, pressed down on him, crushing him under the burden of his own making. He stumbled back, the chair a lifeline he grasped desperately. The cold reality bit, sharp and brutal. The truth and the monstrous implications it carried had arrived. The doctor's words, "It's a match," hung in the air, a stark, brutal punctuation to the suffocating silence. Julian felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him pallid and weak. The mahogany chair, once a symbol of his power, felt like a cold, unforgiving tomb. The sterile scent of the clinic, usually unnoticed, now clawed at his nostrils, a suffocating reminder of his impending reality. He stared at the DNA report, the black ink, blurring through a film of unshed tears. Ava, his daughter. The weight of his actions crashed down, crushing him beneath the avalanche of his own self-loathing. He stumbled out of the clinic, the crisp December air stinging his lungs, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of his guilt. The city lights, usually a glittering spectacle of his success, now mocked him with their indifference. Each glittering jewel was a stark reminder of his arrogance, his blinding privilege that had allowed him to dismiss Ava with such callous disregard. He drove home, the city blurring into streaks of color, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of fragmented memories. He recalled Ava's unwavering dignity, her quiet strength in the face of his cruel machinations. He saw her face, clear as day, superimposed over the face of the woman from his college days, Sarah. The resemblance was uncanny, a chilling confirmation of the truth. The realization ripped through him, a searing pain, a gut-wrenching acknowledgement of his own monstrous blindness. He reached his mansion, the imposing structure seeming smaller, less significant than the monumental task that now lay before him. He needed to see Ava, to confess, to beg for forgiveness. But how could he even begin to approach her, after all the hurt he had inflicted? How could he face the woman he had tried so hard to destroy, knowing she was the one piece of his life he had unwittingly cherished and discarded? The weight of his impending confession was unbearable. He had to tell her, but the thought of facing her fury, her justified anger, paralyzed him. His opulent home, once a sanctuary of comfort, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in the labyrinth of his own creation. He sunk into a plush armchair, the softness failing to cushion the brutal weight of his truth. The future, once a predictable path of success and power, was now an uncharted territory of uncertainty, filled with the daunting prospect of repairing the damage he had wrought, starting with his own daughter. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Julian's control, felt oppressive. He pushed away the DNA report, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the trembling in his hands. The city lights, visible through the panoramic window, blurred through his unshed tears. He hadn't slept properly in days, the gnawing guilt a constant companion. His phone vibrated. A text from Damon. "Dad, we need to talk. Ava's. She's struggling." Julian felt a fresh wave of nausea. He deserved this. He deserved the sleepless nights, the churning stomach, the crushing weight of his own actions. He hadn't just hurt Ava. He'd shattered her trust, wounded her spirit. He called Damon, his voice a strained whisper. "I know, son. I know what I did. I need to see her." "She won't see you, Dad." Damon's voice was laced with weariness. "Not now. She's devastated. She needs time." "I understand," Julian whispered, the word catching in his throat. He understood, but understanding didn't alleviate the burning guilt that consumed him. "But I have to try. I have to tell her the truth. Tell her everything." A long silence hung between them, broken only by the faint city hum. Then, Damon sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "Okay, Dad, but be prepared. This isn't going to be easy." Julian stared out at the city, a tapestry of lights weaving a silent lament. He thought of Ava's quiet strength, her dignity in the face of his cruelty. The truth, the terrible, magnificent truth, hung over him like a dark cloud, promising both devastation and the faintest possibility of redemption. He had to face her, not as the powerful CEO, but as a broken, repentant father. The journey would be arduous, but he would walk it, one agonizing step at a time. The weight of his secret, once a suffocating burden, now felt like a potential catalyst for change. He would beg for forgiveness, for a chance to rebuild what he had so carelessly destroyed. The sterile white of the lab felt colder than the winter wind whipping outside. Julian clutched the results, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the clammy sweat on his palms. He'd expected a clinical detachment, a detached observation of facts. Instead, a wave of nausea washed over him, the city lights outside a dizzying blur. He'd commissioned the test under a false name, a cloak of secrecy that now felt suffocating. He unfolded the paper, his breath catching in his throat. The stark black lettering seared itself into his consciousness. Paternity confirmed. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Ava, his daughter. The bitter irony choked him. His disdain, his attempts to buy her off, his casual cruelty, all aimed at a woman who carried his blood. The mahogany of his office felt different now, less a symbol of power, more a tomb. He sank into his chair, the leather cool against his burning skin. The weight of his actions pressed down, a mountain of guilt threatening to bury him. He thought of her strength, her unwavering dignity, the way she'd met his blatant insults with a quiet, resolute calm. That strength, that resilience, he saw it now, a reflection of himself, a part of him he'd rejected, scorned. His phone buzzed again, another text from Damon. "Dad, it's getting worse. Ava. She's barely speaking." The words struck him like a physical blow. He had to see her. He had to tell her. But how could he possibly face her, knowing the truth? How could he explain the years of subtle cruelty, the calculated attempts to destroy her happiness? The thought was a razor blade twisting in his gut. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. The city lights, once a symbol of his success, now mocked him with their indifferent brilliance. He looked at the DNA results, the stark confirmation of his worst fears, and a single agonizing tear traced a path down his cheek. He had to make amends. He had to try. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling, and dialed Damon's number. "I'm coming home, son." His voice was ragged, choked with a grief too profound for words. The journey ahead would be a long and arduous one, but he would embark on it, fueled by a desperate hope for forgiveness and a chance to finally, truly, be a father. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's trembling hands. The DNA results, crisp and unforgiving, lay beside a half-empty glass of scotch, the amber liquid mirroring the burning shame in his eyes. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering tapestry of indifference to his inner turmoil. He reread the words, each syllable a hammer blow to his already shattered ego. Paternity confirmed. Eva, his daughter. The weight of his actions pressed down, crushing him beneath the burden of his own prejudice. His phone buzzed, a jarring interruption to his self-flagellation. It was Damon, his voice tight with worry. "Dad, it's terrible. Eva, she's leaving, packing her things." The news hit Julian like a physical blow. He pictured Eva, her usually vibrant spirit extinguished, her eyes clouded with hurt he'd inflicted. A wave of nausea washed over him, stronger than before. He had to stop this. He had to fix it. He stumbled from his chair, the polished floor cold beneath his bare feet. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of power and comfort, felt like a prison. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic thump of his own racing heart. He needed air, needed to escape the suffocating walls of his self-condemnation. He stepped onto the balcony, the night air a shock to his system. The city lights blurred through his tears, each twinkling spark a mocking reminder of his wealth, his power, his utter failure as a father. He had to tell her, he had to face her, but the sheer enormity of the task, the immensity of his transgression, left him paralyzed with fear. He picked up his phone again, his fingers clumsy, his resolve faltering. He needed to talk to Damon, to make a plan, to find a way to reach Eva before it was too late. The words he'd rehearsed in his mind crumbled into dust. All he could manage was a choked whisper, "I'm coming home, son." The journey ahead would be a crucible, a fiery trial that would test the limits of his strength, his capacity for remorse, and ultimately, his capacity for love. The sterile white of the hospital waiting room felt oppressive. Julian, normally a picture of controlled power, fidgeted, the expensive fabric of his suit suddenly itchy against his skin. Each tick of the clock amplified the turmoil in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. He hadn't slept in days, the revelation of Ava's true identity a relentless, gnawing presence. The scent of antiseptic, usually unnoticed, now clung to him, a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the irreversible damage he'd caused. Damon arrived, his face etched with exhaustion and concern. "Anything, Dad?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Julian shook his head, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He'd spent hours rehearsing apologies, explanations, but the words felt inadequate, hollow against the enormity of his actions. He wanted to reach out, to touch his son, to find some solace in shared grief, but the gesture felt too presumptuous, too heavy with the weight of his guilt. The door finally opened, and a nurse emerged, her expression neutral. She called out Ava's name, and the silence that followed felt pregnant with anticipation, with the crushing weight of unspoken truths. Damon's hand tightened on Julian's arm, a silent plea for strength, a fragile connection in the face of the impending storm. Julian's breath hitched. This was it, the moment of reckoning, the chance for redemption, or a deeper descent into the abyss of his own making. The next few words would determine the course of not just his future, but the future of his family, forever irrevocably altered. The nurse's voice, soft yet firm, sliced through the suffocating silence. "Ms. Morrow," Ava emerged, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. She looked smaller, somehow more vulnerable than Julian remembered. The strength he'd admired, the quiet dignity that had so infuriated him, was now fragile, almost extinguished. The antiseptic scent, sharp and clinical, seemed to amplify her fragility. Julian's throat constricted. He wanted to rush to her, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but his legs felt rooted to the floor, weighted down by the enormity of his actions. Damon squeezed his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the emotional tempest brewing. Ava's gaze swept across the room, settling on Damon first, a flicker of recognition and fragile hope in her eyes. Then, her eyes met Julian's, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The look in her eyes wasn't anger, not yet. It was a profound, heartbreaking disappointment, a look that pierced through him, exposing the raw, ugly truth of his actions. "Dad." Damon's voice was a low murmur, laced with uncertainty. Julian's lips trembled. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing down on him, crushing him under the burden of his guilt. The silence stretched, agonizingly long, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor somewhere in the distance. The sterile scent of the hospital was suddenly overwhelming, a stark reminder of the life he'd almost destroyed. He wanted to reach out, to touch Ava, to somehow convey the depth of his remorse, but the chasm between them felt insurmountable. The truth, brutal and inescapable, hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket woven from years of prejudice and denial. This was more than just a DNA test result. It was the unraveling of a lifetime of carefully constructed lies. The paper crinkled in Julian's trembling hand. The stark black lettering of the lab report swam before his eyes, blurring into an indistinguishable mess. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a chilling wave that washed over him, leaving him breathless and numb. The sterile scent of the hospital waiting room, usually a neutral background hum, now felt suffocating, a physical manifestation of his mounting horror. Ava, his daughter. He reread the results, each word a hammer blow to his already shattered self-esteem. The undeniable truth, stark and unforgiving, hit him with the force of a physical impact. His carefully constructed world, built on wealth and power, crumbled around him. The years of carefully cultivated indifference, the casual racism he'd worn like a shield, now felt like a grotesque parody of his own being. Shame, hot and suffocating, choked him. Damon, sensing the cataclysmic shift in his father, placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, his touch hesitant yet reassuring. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the frantic thump-thump-thump of Julian's own heart. "Dad?" Damon's voice was barely a whisper, laced with a mixture of shock and profound sadness. Julian could only manage a strangled sob, the sound tearing through the suffocating silence. He looked at his son, his face etched with the raw agony of revelation and regret, a face ravaged by the weight of his actions. He tried to buy off his own daughter. The thought was a searing brand, a mark of his own monstrous failure as a human being. The decades of carefully constructed walls, his armor against vulnerability, now lay in ruins. He sank into the unforgiving hardness of the plastic chair, the cheap material offering no comfort against the crushing weight of his guilt. His carefully constructed life, his reputation, his arrogance, all felt meaningless now, trivial compared to the profound devastation he had inflicted on the woman he had subconsciously recognized as his own reflection. The image of Ava's face, her expression of heartbreaking disappointment, burned into his mind, a constant, searing reminder of the damage he had caused. The simple word "Dad," spoken with such aching uncertainty, resonated with a pain that cut him to the core. The future, once so certain, now stretched before him, an uncharted wilderness filled with the daunting task of reconciliation and redemption. He had to fix this. He had to. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Julian, a bitter counterpoint to the sweetness of the coffee Damon had brought him. He hadn't touched it. The lukewarm liquid sat untouched beside the crumpled DNA report, a stark white square against the bleak hospital table. The revelation hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating, a silent scream echoing in the cavernous space of his heart. He hadn't spoken since Damon had uttered that fragile "Dad?" A question hanging suspended between hope and despair. I don't understand," Julian finally croaked, his voice raw, a mere whisper against the oppressive silence. His throat felt constricted, each word a physical struggle. The words were a pathetic attempt to grasp at something solid in the shifting sands of his reality. Damon's hand remained on his shoulder, a comforting weight in the storm of Julian's emotions. "Neither do I, Dad," he said softly, his voice filled with a weary sadness that mirrored Julian's own turmoil. "But we have to try and fix this." Julian looked at his son, seeing the pain reflected in his eyes, a pain that mirrored his own. A wave of nausea threatened to overcome him, a physical manifestation of his guilt. He'd built his life on a foundation of prejudice, and now the foundation had crumbled, revealing the ugly truth of his own flawed character. The luxury of his life, the success he'd so meticulously cultivated, felt trivial, meaningless against the crushing weight of his self-loathing. He closed his eyes, the image of Ava's face, her expression a heartbreaking blend of hurt and disbelief, flashing before his mind's eye. The memory was a searing brand, a constant, agonizing reminder of his actions. He'd hurt her, deeply, irrevocably, and she was his daughter. The sheer horror of it choked him, leaving him gasping for air, the antiseptic smell suddenly overpowering. "How?" he whispered, the single word a testament to his utter bewilderment and the profound sense of loss that threatened to overwhelm him. The future, once so predictable, so secure, now stretched before him, a terrifying, uncharted wilderness. He'd have to navigate this treacherous landscape alone, burdened by the weight of his past and the daunting task of seeking redemption. And he had to start now. The hospital room felt colder now, the sterile scent sharper, mirroring the icy dread that gripped Julian. Damon's hand, still on his shoulder, offered little comfort. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, a relentless reminder of the fragility of life, of the life he'd so carelessly damaged. He finally looked at his son, the raw pain in Damon's eyes a mirror reflecting his own self-hatred. "How?" he whispered again, the question a choked sob. The word hung in the air, a testament to his utter bewilderment. Damon squeezed his shoulder, his touch gentle yet firm. "We need to tell Ava," he said, his voice low, laced with a weariness that belied his age. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The weight of the truth, the crushing burden of the revelation, pressed down on both of them. Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his guilt. The coffee, untouched, mocked him with its bitter aroma. He saw Ava's face again, the hurt, the disbelief, a searing image etched onto the canvas of his mind. He'd hurt her, his own daughter, beyond measure. The realization hit him anew, each wave of understanding bringing a fresh surge of nausea. He imagined the scene, breaking the news, watching her face crumple, witnessing the shattering of her trust. He knew he deserved her anger, her scorn, her complete and utter rejection. He deserved the pain he'd inflicted. He deserved to feel the full force of his own self-loathing. The luxury of his life, the power and the wealth, felt meaningless against this crushing reality. "I don't know how," he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the vast emptiness of his soul. The future, once a carefully orchestrated tapestry of success and predictability, now stretched before him as a bleak and unforgiving landscape. His carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of privilege and prejudice, lay in ruins. He had to navigate this treacherous terrain, alone, burdened by his past, haunted by his actions, and driven by the desperate need for redemption. The journey ahead promised pain, and he knew he deserved every bit of it. But it was a journey he had to embark upon. For Ava, for Damon, and for himself. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Julian's clothes, a bitter perfume mirroring the taste of ashes in his mouth. He stared at the DNA report, the stark black lettering a cruel mockery of his carefully constructed life. The cold hospital room pressed in on him, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor a relentless counterpoint to the frantic hammering of his own heart. Damon sat beside him, his silence a heavy blanket. I don't understand, Julian finally whispered, his voice cracking. The words felt inadequate, pathetic, a flimsy defense against the avalanche of guilt. Damon squeezed his hand, his touch a rare offering of comfort. It's Ava, Dad. She's your daughter. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken sorrow. The revelation hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. He saw Ava's face, her sharp intelligence, her quiet dignity, her resilience, all reflecting a familiar strength he'd once possessed. A strength he'd buried under layers of arrogance and prejudice. The sharp sting of regret seared his soul. He had judged her, dismissed her, insulted her, his own daughter. A wave of nausea washed over him. The expensive coffee Damon had brought sat untouched, its bitter aroma a cruel irony. He'd offered her money, believing he could buy her off, erase her from his son's life. The sheer absurdity of it choked him. How could I? He choked out, the question lost in a sob. Damon didn't answer, his gaze fixed on his father's ravaged face. The silence stretched, taut with unspoken emotions. The weight of the truth pressed down on them both, heavy and suffocating. Julian pictured Ava, the hurt in her eyes, the wound he'd inflicted. The thought was a physical pain. He deserved her anger. He deserved her contempt. He deserved the ruin of his carefully constructed world. The immense wealth, the power, the success, it all felt hollow, meaningless against the crushing weight of his revelation. He needed to tell her. He had to. But how could he face her? How could he possibly begin to repair the damage he had done? The road ahead was arduous, fraught with uncertainty and pain. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that he had to walk it. For Ava, for Damon, and for himself. He had to begin the long, arduous journey towards redemption. The first step? The truth. The sterile hospital room felt colder now, the silence amplifying the turmoil within him. Julian sat rigidly, the DNA report a crumpled weight in his trembling hand. The crisp white paper mocked his carefully curated life, its stark black print a stark contrast to the swirling chaos in his mind. He tasted bile, the metallic tang a bitter counterpoint to the untouched coffee growing cold beside him. Damon's hand rested on his, a silent offering of comfort that felt both fragile and surprisingly strong. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor seemed to mock the frantic hammering of Julian's own heart. He looked at his son, the lines of worry etched deep on Damon's usually carefree face. "She's my daughter," Julian whispered, the words catching in his throat. The confession was a raw, exposed nerve, vulnerable and aching. He felt the weight of years of prejudice and denial crushing him, suffocating him under the immense weight of his revelation. The memory of Ava's face flooded his mind, her intelligence, her quiet dignity, her unwavering strength. He'd seen it all, dismissed it all, as the arrogant posturing of an upstart. His own daughter. The thought was a physical blow, a searing brand of regret imprinted on his soul. He pictured her, hurt and bewildered. He remembered her quiet grace, and the sharp, cutting words he'd thrown at her like poisoned darts. He'd offered her money, a disgusting attempt to buy her silence, to erase her from his life. The sheer arrogance, the cold cruelty of it, made his stomach churn. He'd insulted her, dismissed her, dehumanized her. His own daughter. How could I be so blind? He choked out, the question a desperate plea for understanding, even from himself. Damon didn't answer, his gaze fixed on his father's ravaged face. The silence hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken guilt and sorrow. The weight of the truth pressed down, suffocating, unbearable. Julian closed his eyes, the image of Ava's wounded pride burning behind his eyelids. He deserved her anger. He deserved her contempt. He deserved the shattering of his carefully constructed world. The wealth, the power, the success, it was all meaningless, hollow dust. He had to tell her. He had to face her, face the consequences of his actions. The road ahead was a daunting, terrifying climb, a path paved with uncertainty and pain. But he had to walk it, for Ava, for Damon, and for the fractured, broken man staring back at him from the reflection in the cold, sterile glass of the hospital window. The first step was the hardest. The truth. He had to tell her the truth. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's trembling hands. He stared at the phone, its sleek surface reflecting his ravaged face. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to him, a grim reminder of the hospital room where the truth had shattered his world. He'd spent hours replaying Ava's image, her strength, her quiet dignity, all twisted into a weapon by his own prejudice. He picked up the phone, his fingers clumsy and unsteady. He dialed Ava's number, the ringing a discordant counterpoint to the hammering in his chest. Each ring felt like a nail hammered into the already fractured pieces of his self-worth. It went to voicemail. He left a message, his voice a strained whisper, choked with unshed tears and regret. Ava, it's Julian. I need to talk to you. Please call me back. He hung up, the phone slipping from his numb fingers, clattering onto the polished wood. He sank into his chair, the leather cool against his skin. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his reflection in the darkened window a stranger. The weight of his actions pressed down, crushing him under the avalanche of his own guilt. He tried to buy her off, a grotesque act of arrogance born from his ingrained prejudices. Now, faced with the truth, his wealth felt insignificant, his power a cruel joke. Days blurred into a haze of restless nights and anxious days. Each unanswered call felt like a confirmation of his worst fears. He'd lost Ava, his daughter, through his own hateful blindness. He pictured Damon's worried face, the unspoken concern in his eyes. His son, his only son, caught in the crossfire of his father's monumental mistake. He had to fix this. He had to try. He found Damon in the study, lost in the comforting distraction of a complex chess game. The silence between them was heavy, laden with the unspoken weight of the revelation. Damon looked up, his eyes mirroring the storm raging within his father. Julian saw the hurt, the disillusionment, the cautious hope. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched, thick and unforgiving, until Damon finally spoke. "She won't answer your calls, Dad. She's hurt." The simple statement held a world of unspoken accusation. Julian nodded, a single, agonizing movement. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The guilt was a physical entity, a suffocating weight threatening to crush him. "I deserve her anger. I deserve her contempt." The words were a confession, a plea for understanding, and a stark recognition of his own culpability. He needed to atone. He needed to heal the wounds he had so carelessly inflicted. The road to redemption wouldn't be easy. He knew that, but he had to start somewhere, somehow. The first step was already taken, the admission of his truth. Now he must confront the consequences. The sterile scent of his mahogany desk offered little comfort. Julian traced the grain of the wood, the polished surface a stark contrast to the roughness of his own emotions. He reread Ava's email, the words burning into his retinas. "Your apology is meaningless. The hurt you caused runs deeper than any words can fix." He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a physical manifestation of his guilt. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window, mirroring the chaos within him. He hadn't eaten in days, the weight loss adding to the gauntness of his face. His reflection was a stranger, a haunted version of the man he once was. The power, the wealth, the success, they felt hollow, meaningless against the crushing weight of his mistake. He thought of his past self, arrogant and callous, and recoiled. How could he have been so blind, so cruel? His phone buzzed. Damon. He hesitated, the tremor in his hand betraying his anxiety. He finally answered, his voice a raspy whisper. "Damon? Dad, I talked to Ava again." Damon's voice was strained, filled with a weariness that mirrored Julian's own. She's willing to meet, but she wants to meet at her office. Not here, not at your house. Her terms." Julian felt a flicker of hope, fragile as a newborn bird. "Her office? Okay, tell her. Tell her I'll be there in an hour." He hung up, the silence suddenly deafening. An hour. 60 minutes to prepare for a conversation that could make or break everything. 60 minutes to confront the daughter he'd wronged, the woman he'd tried to buy, the truth he'd suppressed for decades. He rose, his legs unsteady, and moved towards the window, the city lights a silent witness to his internal struggle. The rain continued to fall, a steady, relentless rhythm reflecting the ongoing storm within his soul. He had to face the consequences of his actions, not just for Ava, but for himself, for Damon, for the man he desperately wanted to become. The journey would be arduous, filled with pain, but for the first time, he felt a sliver of hope, a tentative step towards redemption. The sterile air of Ava's office hummed with a low, almost imperceptible tension. Julian stood awkwardly near the window, the city sprawling beneath him, a dizzying panorama he couldn't quite appreciate. He clutched his briefcase, its smooth leather a stark contrast to the tremor in his hands. The scent of expensive coffee hung in the air, a bitter reminder of the lavish life he'd always taken for granted, a life that now felt profoundly empty. Ava entered, her tailored suit sharp against the muted tones of her office. Her face was carefully composed, yet he saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, a silent accusation that cut deeper than any shouted word. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a clock on the wall, each second an agonizing reminder of the time lost, the damage done. "I'm glad you came," Ava said, her voice low, controlled. It was a statement, not a greeting devoid of warmth. The coolness in her tone felt like a physical blow. Julian swallowed, his throat tight. "Ava, he started, but the words failed him. He felt the weight of his past actions, the crushing weight of his prejudice, his arrogance. The carefully constructed facade of his successful life crumbled under the raw emotion of this moment. "Don't," Ava interrupted, her voice edged with steel. "Don't try to apologize. Words are cheap, Father. Your actions spoke volumes." Her eyes, usually bright and intelligent, were clouded with a sorrow that pierced him to the core. He saw a reflection of his own pain in her gaze, a chilling testament to the damage he had wrought. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to explain, to unravel the tangled mess of his emotions, his guilt, his regret. But he knew that any explanation, any apology, would ring hollow unless backed by genuine change. This wasn't about words, it was about actions. It was about rebuilding trust, brick by agonizing brick, from the foundation of his own broken promises. The rain outside intensified, mirroring the storm raging within him. A storm he knew he had to weather alone, and with her, if she would allow him. The mahogany desk between them felt like a chasm, a stark divider in the already fractured landscape of their relationship. Ava's silence was a tangible thing, heavy with unshed tears and simmering resentment. The muted gray of her office, usually a sanctuary of calm efficiency, now felt oppressive, mirroring the weight of Julian's guilt. He shifted uncomfortably, the expensive Italian leather of his shoes creaking against the polished floor, a small, almost insignificant sound that amplified the vastness of the silence. "Ava," he began again, his voice a rough rasp. "I understand if you can't forgive me. I don't expect you to. But I need you to know." He paused, searching for the right words, words that could possibly bridge the gulf between them. The words felt inadequate, flimsy against the weight of his actions. Ava's gaze, sharp and unwavering, met his. "Know what, Father?" she asked, her voice low and controlled, each word precise, measured, like a surgeon's scalpel dissecting his soul. The scent of lilies, usually a calming presence in her office, now felt cloying, suffocating. A cruel irony given the emotional suffocation he'd inflicted. He swallowed, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. "Know that I never knew, that I would never have intentionally hurt you. The thought, it's unbearable." He looked away, unable to meet her piercing gaze. The rain outside intensified, its drumming against the panoramic window a mournful counterpoint to the turmoil within him. Ava rose from her chair, her movement elegant but devoid of warmth. She walked towards the window, her silhouette framed against the stormy cityscape. The city lights, usually a glittering symbol of his success, felt cold and distant. He watched her, his heart a captive bird beating against the bars of his own making. "Knowing isn't enough," she said, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the roar of the storm. "Knowing doesn't undo the years of pain, the subtle slights, the blatant insults. Knowing doesn't erase the humiliation of your offer." She turned, her face etched with a profound sadness that mirrored his own. "It took a DNA test to make you see me, to make you see your own daughter," she finished, her voice choked with unshed tears. The silence that followed was broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain, a relentless rhythm echoing the storm raging within them both. Julian left Ava's office, the city's relentless rain mirroring the tempest in his soul. The sleek, minimalist architecture of her building, usually a testament to her success, now felt cold and unwelcoming. He sank into the plush leather of his car, the scent of expensive cologne doing little to mask the bitter taste of regret. His phone vibrated. It was Damon. "Dad." Damon's voice was strained, laced with a weariness Julian recognized in himself. "I need to talk." The meeting took place at Damon's favorite whiskey bar, a dimly lit haven tucked away from the city's clamor. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, were a muted backdrop to their tense conversation. Damon, usually jovial, was grave. "She's hurt, Dad," Damon said, his gaze intense, deeply, "and I don't know if she can forgive you." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clicking softly against the crystal. This wasn't just about money, was it? It was about her being black, about her not being good enough. Julian flinched. Damon's words, though harsh, were true. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, the weight of his prejudice crushing him. He looked at his son, the man he'd always been proud of, his face etched with disappointment. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with shame. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool." Damon sighed, the sound heavy with years of unspoken resentment. "I need you to fix this, Dad, for her and for us." He met his father's gaze, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "She deserves more than an apology. She deserves to know that you see her, really see her." The rain outside had ceased, leaving behind a damp chill in the air. Julian felt a similar chill settle in his bones, the cold grip of understanding and remorse. He looked up at his son. The chasm between them was still there, but it seemed a little less wide, a little less unbridgeable. A fragile bridge of hope had been built on the wreckage of his arrogance. His journey towards redemption had begun, a long, arduous climb from the depths of his own making. The sterile white of the lab's envelope felt like a branding iron against Julian's palm. He'd avoided looking at it for hours, the weight of its contents pressing down on him like a physical burden. The city lights blurred through his rain-streaked window, mirroring the chaos within. He finally tore it open, his breath catching in his throat. The stark black print confirmed what he dreaded and secretly hoped for. Ava was his daughter. A wave of nausea washed over him, the expensive scotch he'd been nursing doing nothing to soothe the burning in his throat. The room spun, the polished mahogany of his desk blurring into an indistinct swirl. He sank into his chair, the leather groaning under his weight, a sound that echoed the collapse of his carefully constructed world. Guilt, raw and visceral, clawed at him. His meticulously planned life, built on power and control, crumbled into dust. He judged her, insulted her, tried to buy her off, his own daughter. The memory of Ava's quiet dignity, her unwavering strength in the face of his cruelty, pierced him like shards of glass. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling. He needed to talk to Ava, to apologize, to explain. But what could he possibly say? How could he undo the damage he'd inflicted? He dialed her number, the ring echoing in the silence of his opulent office. each tone a hammer blow to his already shattered composure. It went straight to voicemail. The cold, impersonal message felt like another rejection, a stark reminder of the chasm he'd created. He hung up, the phone slipping from his numb fingers, the silence amplifying the deafening roar of his guilt. The city outside, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a cold, uncaring witness to his profound failure. His empire, once his pride, felt like a gilded cage, confining him to a prison of his own making. The journey ahead, he knew, would be long and arduous. But he had to try. He had to begin to mend the broken pieces of his own creation, his own daughter's heart, and his own soul. The mahogany desk felt cold against Julian's cheek. The city's glittering expanse, usually a source of pride, now mocked him with its indifferent brilliance. The DNA results, a stark testament to his blindness, lay discarded beside the half-empty Scotch glass, a bitter reminder of his arrogance. He tried Ava's number again, and again, each unanswered call chipping away at his already fragile composure. He pictured her, the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she carried herself with such poise despite his relentless attacks. The thought of his cruelty, the sting of his rejection, now amplified tenfold by the knowledge of her bloodline, was unbearable. He ran a trembling hand through his thinning hair, the luxurious strands feeling coarse and brittle against his skin. His phone buzzed, a text from Damon. "Dad, we need to talk. Meet me at the usual." The usual was the quiet corner of their favorite Italian restaurant, a sanctuary from the clamor of Julian's opulent life. He felt a flicker of hope, a small ember in the vast wasteland of his guilt. Maybe, just maybe, Damon could help him bridge the chasm he'd created. The restaurant's subdued lighting felt like a haven. Damon, his face etched with a mixture of weariness and concern, sat waiting. The aroma of garlic and oregano couldn't mask the tension hanging heavy in the air. "She won't take my calls, Dad," Damon said, his voice low. "She's hurt. Beyond hurt." Julian nodded, unable to articulate the torrent of remorse churning within him. The words, "She's my daughter," felt inadequate, hollow against the enormity of his transgression. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of guilt. "I understand," Julian finally rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I deserve her anger, but I need to fix this, Damon. I need to make it right." Damon studied him, his gaze searching, assessing. "It's going to take more than words, Dad. It's going to take everything." The unspoken words hung in the air: time, effort, genuine remorse, a complete dismantling of the prejudiced beliefs that had driven him to such cruelty. Julian knew he had a long road ahead, a road paved with apologies and actions, not words. The journey to redemption, he realized, had just begun. The sterile white of the hospital waiting room felt oppressive. Julian, usually so comfortable in his tailored suits and polished shoes, felt raw and exposed. The air hung heavy with the unspoken, a suffocating silence only punctuated by the rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to mock his agonizing weight. He ran a hand over his face, the rough stubble a stark contrast to the smoothness he usually maintained. Each tick of the clock echoed the relentless hammering of his guilt. His phone vibrated, a text, not from Damon, from his lawyer. A single word, "Confirmed." The cold certainty of the word hit Julian like a physical blow. Eva, his daughter, the woman he'd tried to buy off, insult, and destroy. The weight of his actions, his ingrained prejudices, crashed down upon him, suffocating him with its enormity. He felt a wave of nausea, the expensive scotch he'd consumed earlier doing little to soothe the burning in his throat. He stumbled out of the waiting room, needing air, needing escape from the suffocating weight of his revelation. The city lights blurred through his tear-filled eyes. He leaned against a cool marble wall, the chill seeping into his bones, mirroring the icy grip of despair tightening around his heart. He had to reach out to her, to Ava, but the fear of rejection, the anticipated fury in her eyes, paralyzed him. The next day, he tried again, his voice trembling as he dialed her number. He braced himself for the inevitable rejection, the sharp sting of her anger. Instead, he heard only the cold, impersonal ring, echoing the emptiness he felt inside. He left a message, his voice choked with unshed tears, a desperate plea for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. He left it hanging in the digital ether. The only reply was silence. The silence was deafening, confirming the chasm he'd created. He drove back to his penthouse, the city's glittering facade seeming to mock his inner turmoil. The opulent apartment, usually a sanctuary of comfort and luxury, felt like a prison. He stared at his reflection in the glass elevator, seeing not the powerful CEO, but a broken, guilt-ridden man. The journey to redemption, he realized, was far longer and more arduous than he had ever imagined. The first step, reaching out to Damon, felt like a monumental task in itself. The mahogany door of Ava's penthouse apartment felt heavier than any he'd ever encountered. He'd rehearsed his apology countless times, each iteration a clumsy, inadequate attempt to articulate the depth of his regret. The scent of lilies, sharp and sweet, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear in his mouth. He pressed the buzzer, the sound echoing the tremor in his hand. Silence. Then, Ava's voice, cool and controlled, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. "Yes, Ava, it's Julian." His voice, surprisingly steady, betrayed the tempest raging within. Pause, pregnant with unspoken accusations. I need to talk to you." He felt the familiar burn of shame, the weight of his past actions pressing down. The door opened a crack, revealing Ava's face, etched with a weariness that went beyond the years. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and warmth, were guarded, almost cold. "This better be good, Julian." Her voice was clipped, devoid of the warmth he remembered from Damon's descriptions. He stepped inside, the cool marble beneath his feet a strange contrast to the inferno of guilt scorching him. He saw her apartment, sleek and modern, yet somehow empty. The silence hummed with unspoken hurt. He began, his words tumbling out in a rush of apology. "Ava, I know there's no excuse for what I did. The DNA results, they changed everything. I never knew." His voice cracked, the carefully constructed facade crumbling. Tears welled in Ava's eyes, but she didn't flinch. "Knowing doesn't excuse it," she said, her voice low and steady, laced with quiet fury. "You tried to buy me off, Julian. You humiliated me." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, piercing his already fragile self-esteem. He closed his eyes, the sting of her words a necessary pain. He needed to feel this to understand the depth of his transgression. "I know, and I am so profoundly sorry. I was blind, arrogant, a fool." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze, determined to show her the sincerity of his remorse. The weight of his actions pressed upon him, a physical burden. "I hurt you, and for that, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the residue of past hurts and the tentative hope of a future. Ava's silence hung heavy, a tangible thing in the sterile elegance of her penthouse. The scent of lilies, sharp and sweet, did little to mask the underlying bitterness. Julian watched her, the faint tremor in her hand mirroring his own. He saw the flicker of something, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a sliver of recognition in her usually guarded eyes. He'd expected anger, a torrent of justified rage. This quiet intensity was far more unsettling. "I understand if you can't forgive me," he finally said, his voice rough. The words felt inadequate, flimsy against the weight of his actions. He saw a faint twitch at the corner of her mouth, a barely perceptible shift that could have been a sigh or a grimace. "Understanding and forgiveness are two different things, Julian," Ava replied, her voice low. The chill in it hadn't entirely melted, but the sharp edges were softened. She ran a hand through her hair, a gesture that revealed the exhaustion etched onto her face. He watched her, the years of carefully constructed walls crumbling before his eyes. He saw the woman Damon loved, strong and independent, but also profoundly hurt. He saw a reflection, a distorted mirror image of his own past self, driven by ambition and blinded by privilege. "I know," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly as he raised it to his lips. The cool liquid did little to soothe the burning guilt that gnawed at him. He needed to say more, to do more, but the words escaped him. Ava moved to the window, her back to him. The city lights, a glittering tapestry below, seemed to hold their breath, mirroring the tense silence in the room. He watched her shoulders slump slightly, the weight of the unspoken finally becoming visible. I lost a lot of opportunities because of you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He felt a fresh wave of shame. He'd underestimated the depth of his actions, the ripple effect of his prejudice. He hadn't just hurt her. He had sabotaged her career, her dreams. He took a deep breath. "I know, and I'll do everything in my power to rectify that. I'll use my influence, my resources." He trailed off, knowing that words were cheap. He needed to show her, not just tell her. He met her gaze again, the glittering city lights reflecting in her eyes, mirroring the immense task ahead of him. Rebuilding a relationship shattered by his own arrogance and ignorance, a task as daunting and impossible as scaling the skyscrapers that loomed outside her window. But unlike those buildings, this challenge required not brute force but a painstaking, humble rebuilding from the ground up. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the humid New York air clinging to the penthouse windows. Ava sat rigidly, the city lights blurring through her unshed tears. Julian watched her, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. He'd offered an apology, a clumsy, inadequate attempt at repairing the chasm he'd created. But the words, even as they'd spilled from his lips, had felt hollow, insufficient to bridge the gulf of pain. "It wasn't just the money, Julian," Ava finally said, her voice a low tremor that belied her usual strength. The lilies, their scent previously sharp, now seemed cloyingly sweet, a mockery of the bitterness filling the room. She traced the rim of her wine glass, the delicate crystal cold against her skin. "It was the disrespect, the way you looked at me, like I was something to be bought." He winced, the memory of his own disdain, his arrogant presumption, a searing brand on his soul. The guilt was a relentless tide, pulling him under. He saw the hurt in her eyes, the quiet dignity masking a deeper wound, a wound he'd inflicted with his own ignorance and privilege. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, unsure. She didn't pull away, but she didn't reciprocate either. The contact was brief, a fleeting bridge across the vast emotional divide. "I understand," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. Not just with you, but with myself." He looked out at the city, the twinkling lights a stark contrast to the darkness swirling within him. He saw his own reflection in the glass, a stranger staring back, a man stripped bare of his usual arrogance, exposed in his vulnerability. Ava's gaze softened, a flicker of something akin to compassion crossing her face. It was fragile, easily broken, but it was there, a tiny seed of hope, planted in the barren landscape of their broken relationship. The weight of the past remained, a heavy anchor, but for the first time, Julian glimpsed a path forward, a chance at redemption. The task before him was monumental, yet he felt a surge of resolve, a quiet determination that surprised even him. He had a long way to go, but he would start here in this suffocatingly elegant room, with the woman he had hurt so deeply, his daughter, and begin to rebuild the bridges he'd so carelessly burned. The scent of lilies, sharp and cloying, filled the penthouse, a stark contrast to the raw emotion hanging heavy in the air. Ava's silence was a palpable thing, a wall built of hurt and disbelief. Julian watched her, his own emotions a turbulent sea. He'd apologized, but the words felt inadequate, pathetic even, against the backdrop of his past actions. He reached across the polished mahogany table, his fingers hovering over hers. "Ava," he began, his voice a rough whisper. I know an apology isn't enough, but I need you to understand the depth of my regret. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were now filled with a raw, unfamiliar vulnerability. He saw the flicker of unshed tears in her eyes, a testament to the pain he'd inflicted. Understanding doesn't erase what happened, Ava replied, her voice low and husky, the city lights reflected in her dark eyes, mirroring the storm within. The strength she usually exuded was replaced by a fragile weariness. The money, the subtle digs, the way you treated me like I was beneath you. He winced, the memory of his arrogance a fresh wound. I was blinded by my own prejudices. I was a fool, a heartless fool. He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. He picked up his glass of water, the ice clinking a harsh counterpoint to the silence that followed. He took a deep, shaky breath. I never imagined. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that revealed the unbelievable truth of their relationship. Ava leaned back, her gaze distant, as if trying to distance herself from the pain. I need time, she whispered, the words barely audible above the hum of the city below. The city lights, once a symbol of his success and power, now felt like a cold, unforgiving gaze. He saw the hurt, the betrayal reflected in her eyes, and in that moment, the vastness of the chasm he'd created truly hit him. The weight of his actions, the crushing burden of his own ignorance, threatened to suffocate him. He knew this was only the beginning of his long, difficult journey towards redemption. The road ahead was steep and uncertain, paved with his own mistakes. But for the first time, he saw a path forward, a chance, however small, to repair the damage and earn back a daughter's trust. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of cool, minimalist elegance, felt suffocating. The scent of lilies, intensified by the silence, seemed to mock Julian's attempts at contrition. Ava's silence wasn't just a wall. It was a fortress built of years of ingrained prejudice, now crumbling under the weight of a shocking truth. He watched her, her dark eyes mirroring the city lights, distant, unreadable. The usual sharp angles of her face were softened by a weariness that broke his heart. He reached for her hand again, this time his touch hesitant, unsure. Ava, he began, his voice barely a breath above a whisper. I understand if you need time, more than time. I deserve your anger, but I want you to know I didn't know. I truly didn't know. His words were choked with emotion, his throat constricting with the unspoken weight of his revelation. He saw a flicker of something, not forgiveness, not even understanding, but a glimmer of recognition in the depths of her eyes. A flicker of the shared past he had so brutally denied. Knowing doesn't erase the hurt, Father, she replied, her voice low, laced with pain. The humiliation, the way you treated me, as if I was nothing. The city lights blurred through his tears. He saw his own reflection in her pained expression. A man he barely recognized, a stranger cloaked in wealth and power, yet utterly devoid of empathy. He felt the crushing weight of his actions, not just on Ava, but on the damaged relationship with his son, the ripples of his prejudice spreading outward, staining everything he had ever touched. He thought of the years lost, the potential for a loving relationship stolen by his blindness. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. He knew apologies were insufficient. Actions were required, a lifetime of amends to begin to make up for the damage inflicted. This was merely the first step on a long and arduous journey. The penthouse suite, usually a beacon of cold, sterile luxury, felt strangely intimate under the weight of their unspoken words. Ava's gaze, usually sharp and unwavering, held a fragile vulnerability. The city lights, a glittering tapestry below, seemed to dim in comparison to the storm raging within her. Julian watched her, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of his self-imposed isolation, now felt suffocating, a cruel reminder of his arrogance. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the heavy silence. "Ava," he began again, his voice hoarse. I don't expect forgiveness. Not yet. But I need you to understand. The man who treated you that way, he wasn't entirely me. He was a shadow, a product of my own ignorance and fear." Ava didn't speak, but the subtle tremor in her hand, as she adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, spoke volumes. Her silence was a chasm, a testament to the depth of his transgression. He saw a flicker of something, a hesitant curiosity. Perhaps replace the wall of hurt. It was a crack in the fortress, and it gave him a sliver of hope. He rose and walked to the expansive window, the city lights blurring through his unshed tears. The glittering panorama felt distant, unreal, compared to the raw emotion flooding his senses. "I hid behind my success," he confessed, his voice breaking. "Behind my wealth, I was terrified of facing my own shortcomings, my own prejudices, and I took it out on you, on my own daughter." He turned, his eyes fixed on hers. He saw the years of pain etched into her face, the resilience she developed to survive his cruelty. He saw himself in her strength, a reflection he'd previously ignored. "I have no excuse," he admitted, his voice choked with regret. "But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make amends, to become a father worthy of you." The silence returned, but it was different now, less hostile, tinged with a cautious hope. Ava's gaze softened slightly, her expression unreadable. Yet the icy wall that separated them had begun to thaw. The city, once a symbol of his untouchable power, now seemed to reflect a world he was finally ready to engage with, honestly and vulnerably. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the cloying scent of lilies. Ava didn't speak, her silence a stark contrast to the city's vibrant hum outside. The penthouse, usually a symbol of Julian's detached power, felt claustrophobic, the vast space shrinking around them. He watched her, his breath catching in his throat, as a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was a tear not of anger, but of weary exhaustion, a silent testament to years of suppressed pain. He moved closer, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet. He reached out, his hand hovering uncertainly before retracting. The gesture, clumsy and hesitant, revealed the depth of his vulnerability. I know I can't erase what I've done," he stammered, his voice trembling, "but I want to try, to understand." Ava finally met his gaze, her eyes pools of dark, unshed sorrow. The sharp intelligence that usually defined her expression was softened, replaced by a raw vulnerability that laid bare the wounds he had inflicted. "Understand?" she whispered, the word barely audible above the city's distant murmur. "Understand what it's like to be judged, dismissed, simply because of who you are?" A wave of nausea washed over him, the bitter taste of regret coating his tongue. He saw the echo of his own prejudices reflected in her pain, a chilling mirror image of his past self. He judged her, dismissed her potential, all based on his own ingrained biases. He treated her not as his daughter, but as an obstacle, a threat to his carefully constructed world. "No," he admitted, his voice raw with self-loathing. "I can't fully understand, but I can try to atone. I can start by accepting the consequences of my actions, and by earning your trust even if it takes a lifetime." He paused, searching for the right words, each syllable laden with a lifetime of regret. "I failed you, Ava, as a father, as a man." The silence stretched, a fragile bridge between their broken relationship. The city lights, once a symbol of his invulnerability, now seemed to mock his helplessness. He longed for the ability to erase the past, to undo the damage he had caused. But all he could offer was a promise, a fragile hope of a future built on remorse and a desperate need for redemption. The city lights shimmered outside, reflecting the uncertain but nascent glimmer of hope in his daughter's eyes. The penthouse suite, usually a sanctuary of cool, minimalist design, felt suffocating. The scent of lilies, Ava's favorite, now mocked Julian's attempts at reconciliation. He watched her, the city lights painting streaks of color across her face, highlighting the weariness etched into her usually sharp features. He'd underestimated her strength, her resilience. He'd mistaken her quiet dignity for weakness. I understand if you can't forgive me," he began, his voice a low tremor against the city's hum. The words felt inadequate, pale in the face of the hurt he'd inflicted. Ava's gaze remained fixed on the cityscape. The silence stretched, a chasm between them, filled only with the low thrum of unspoken pain. The cool marble floor felt like ice beneath his bare feet. "Understanding isn't enough, Father," she finally said, her voice low, controlled, but laced with a quiet bitterness. "Understanding doesn't erase the humiliation, the blatant disregard, the casual cruelty." She turned, her profile sharp against the panoramic view. "You tried to buy me off, like I was some commodity." He winced, the memory of his crass offer, the sheer arrogance of his actions, burned through him. He reached out again, his hand trembling this time. He couldn't touch her, not yet. He hadn't earned the right. "I know," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool." He looked at his hands, calloused from a lifetime of grasping for power, now useless in their attempts at comfort. "I saw your success, your intelligence, and instead of seeing my daughter, I saw a threat." A tear slipped down her cheek, a solitary track of grief through the carefully constructed composure she maintained. The city lights blurred through his own unshed tears. He understood then, with a sickening clarity, that his apology was just the first step on a long, arduous path. A path paved with remorse and a desperate need to rebuild the broken trust. The weight of his actions pressed down, heavier than any burden he'd ever faced in his life of relentless ambition. He had to earn her forgiveness, not just offer it. The following morning, Julian found Ava in his sprawling garden, the early sunlight catching the dew on the roses. He'd spent the night wrestling with the enormity of his actions, the weight of his prejudice pressing down like a physical burden. He approached cautiously, the gravel crunching under his shoes a stark counterpoint to the quiet serenity of the garden. Ava didn't turn. She sat on a wrought iron bench, the delicate floral design a jarring contrast to the starkness of her grief. "Ava," he began, his voice raspy from lack of sleep and the turmoil within. The scent of lilies, a subtle reminder of his past failures, hung heavy in the air. She didn't respond, her shoulders stiff, her gaze fixed on the meticulously manicured lawn. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations. He knelt beside her, the cool dampness of the grass seeping into his trousers. I want to help," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached for her hand, but hesitated, unsure if he had the right. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes dark pools reflecting the pain he had caused. "Help?" she repeated, the word a low, bitter whisper. "What kind of help can you possibly offer after everything you've done?" Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the carefully constructed wall of composure she'd maintained. I'll use my resources to rectify the professional setbacks I caused," he offered, his voice strained. "I'll make sure you're compensated for the damage. More than compensated." He felt the words inadequate, hollow even, in the face of her deep hurt. Ava's gaze softened ever so slightly, a flicker of something akin to hope, or perhaps just weary resignation. He saw it, and it gave him a sliver of hope. "That's a start," she admitted, her voice barely audible. The rising sun cast long shadows across the garden, painting the scene with a fragile sense of hope. Julian knew this was only the beginning of a long, arduous journey, but for the first time, he felt the possibility of redemption within his reach. The weight on his chest, though still heavy, felt slightly less crushing. The lilies, once a symbol of his failure, now seemed to carry a faint whisper of forgiveness on the morning breeze. The weight of his apology hung heavy in the air, thick and cloying like the humid summer air clinging to the city. Ava's silence stretched, punctuated only by the chirping of unseen birds in the manicured hedges. Julian watched her, his heart a trapped bird fluttering against his ribs. He saw the tremor in her hand, the way her perfectly sculpted nails dug into the worn wood of the bench. He'd offered restitution, a vast sum of money, but it felt like throwing pebbles at a mountain. "Money can't fix this, can it?" she finally whispered, her voice rough with unshed tears. The words hung between them, a stark acknowledgement of the chasm he had created. He shook his head, the movement slow and deliberate. "No, it can't." He reached for her hand again, this time his touch gentler, more hesitant. She didn't pull away. Her skin, cool and smooth under his fingertips, felt strangely fragile. He spoke, his voice low and measured, choosing his words carefully. "I understand if you can't forgive me. I deserve your anger, your resentment. But I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. I was blind, prejudiced, a fool." He paused, his throat tightening. "I never saw you, Ava. I only saw a shadow, a threat to my perfect world." A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a glistening path down her cheek. It was a tear of pain, of years of suppressed hurt, of the betrayal by the man who should have loved her unconditionally. The silence returned, this time less strained, filled with a shared acknowledgement of the pain. The scent of roses, usually a symbol of beauty and love, felt heavy and suffocating, a reminder of the poisoned bloom of his past actions. He shifted, pulling a small, velvet box from his pocket. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a delicate gold necklace, a simple pendant shaped like a single lily. "This was your mother's," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I found it among my things." The lily, a symbol of his past failings, now became a fragile bridge towards reconciliation. Ava's breath hitched. She took the necklace, her fingers tracing the delicate curves of the gold. The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years and a beginning of healing. The following weeks were a blur of carefully orchestrated amends. Julian, humbled and chastened, used his considerable influence to quietly rectify the professional setbacks he'd inflicted on Ava. He discreetly contacted key board members, offering explanations and apologies, his voice thick with genuine remorse. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars, usually synonymous with his power, now carried the faint, lingering aroma of humility. He'd even donated a substantial sum to Ava's favorite charity, a gesture he initially deemed patronizing but later realized was a small step towards genuine restitution. One crisp autumn evening, he found Ava at her favorite park, a sanctuary she'd sought during the storm of his revelations. The air, tinged with the crispness of falling leaves, carried the sweet scent of damp earth. He approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled on the fallen leaves. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows, painting the scene in hues of amber and gold. "Ava," he began, his voice a low rumble. "May I sit?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling leaves. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken emotions. He watched her, the lines of weariness etched around her eyes a stark reminder of the pain he'd caused. "I know apologies are cheap," he continued, his voice cracking slightly, "but I truly want to make amends, not just financially, but genuinely." Ava turned, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "Actions speak louder than words, Julian." Her voice was low, even, but the steel in her tone was undeniable. He nodded, understanding her skepticism. "I know, and I intend to prove that." He paused, searching for the right words. "Your mother, she was remarkable." A flicker of surprise crossed Ava's face. He'd never spoken of her mother before. This wasn't a calculated move. It was a heartfelt revelation, a bridge built from the fragments of his past. "I wish I had known her, too," Ava whispered, the words catching in her throat. The shared grief, a silent understanding of a lost connection, hung between them, a fragile yet surprisingly strong bond beginning to form. The rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind, the setting sun. all formed a silent chorus to their unspoken reconciliation, a quiet testament to the potential for healing amidst the wreckage of past mistakes. The following weeks were a careful dance of amends. Julian, his usual crisp suits replaced by softer fabrics, frequented Ava's favorite Italian restaurant, leaving small gifts, a rare first edition of her favorite poet, a hand-painted ceramic bowl, quiet gestures of remorse. The aroma of rosemary and garlic, usually a backdrop to his power lunches, now held a poignant resonance, a testament to his evolving self. He'd even begun attending art exhibits, a world he'd previously dismissed as frivolous, now finding solace in the vibrant colors and emotional depth of the paintings, mirroring the complexity of his own inner landscape. One rainy Tuesday, he found Ava at a quiet cafe near her office. The gentle murmur of conversation, a comforting contrast to the city's relentless rhythm. Rain lashed against the large windows, blurring the city lights into shimmering streaks. The scent of brewing coffee mingled with the damp earth outside, a melancholic symphony. He sat opposite her, a nervous energy underlying his calm demeanor. "Ava," he began, his voice a low hum against the cafe's gentle hum. "I know words can't erase the past." Ava met his gaze, her expression a careful blend of guardedness and something akin to weary curiosity. "No," she agreed softly, her voice husky, "but actions can help rebuild what was broken." Julian nodded, the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. "I've been trying. I've reconsidered my involvement with the Blackwood project." The mention of the project, a major professional setback he'd orchestrated against Ava, elicited a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I've already received an apology from Mr. Blackwood." He seemed quite contrite. Her voice held a hint of astonishment, laced with a growing sense of cautious optimism. He had used his influence to mend the professional damage he'd inflicted, proving his words weren't just empty promises. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the glass, a soundtrack to a slow, painstaking reconciliation. The scent of coffee, warm and comforting, no longer felt merely incidental. It was a symbol of the warmth slowly blooming between them, a fragile flower pushing through the cracks in the hardened ground of his prejudice. He saw hope bloom in her eyes, a tiny spark in the dim light of the cafe, a testament to the slow, arduous path towards healing. The rain outside ceased, and a sliver of sunlight pierced the clouds, illuminating the beginning of their tentative peace. The following weeks were a blur of carefully chosen words and hesitant gestures. Julian, his tailored suits softened by cashmere sweaters, found himself drawn to the quiet corners of Ava's world. He sat with her in the hushed reverence of art galleries, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the sterile hues of his corporate office. He learned to listen, truly listen, to her stories, her laughter echoing in the spaces he'd once filled with his own self-important pronouncements. One evening, as the city lights twinkled below them from their penthouse balcony, he poured her a glass of wine. The ruby liquid shimmered in the glass, mirroring the hesitant hope that bloomed in his heart. "Ava," he began, his voice a low rumble against the night's gentle breeze. I want to understand." Ava looked out at the city, her silhouette sharp against the glittering skyline. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, she turned, her eyes, dark and luminous, met his. "Understand what, Julian?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. The wind whipped a stray strand of hair across her face, a fleeting image of vulnerability. "The hurt I caused," he confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The depth of my ignorance, my prejudice." He flinched under the weight of his own admission, the years of self-delusion crumbling beneath the weight of truth. Ava's expression softened slightly. "It wasn't just ignorance, Julian. It was deliberate. You tried to buy me off." The memory stung, a raw nerve exposed. Yet, there was a tremor in her voice, a hint of something beyond anger. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "And for that," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am truly, deeply sorry. There are no excuses. I was blinded by my own arrogance." He paused, searching for the right words, words that could bridge the chasm he'd created. I want to be better. For you. For Damon. The city lights blurred slightly as a tear traced a path down Ava's cheek. It was a tear not just of sorrow, but of something else. Hope. A fragile, tentative hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the man before her was truly trying to change. The wind whispered softly around them, a gentle caress against their shared sorrow, and the promise of a future slowly being rebuilt, brick by painful brick. The following weeks were a delicate dance of apologies and tentative steps towards understanding. Julian, stripped of his usual arrogance, found himself humbled by Ava's quiet strength. He'd replaced the stark lines of his minimalist penthouse with warm, inviting colors, soft lighting replacing the harsh glare of his usual ambience. He'd even hung some of Ava's abstract paintings, the bold strokes a mirror to the emotional turmoil he was navigating. One evening, he found her in their new, shared study, the scent of old books and freshly brewed coffee filling the air. She sat bathed in the soft glow of a desk lamp, her fingers tracing the spine of a worn volume. The sight, so peaceful and familiar, filled him with a poignant ache. Ava, he began, his voice hesitant. I've been thinking about the foundation. He'd set up a significant scholarship fund for underprivileged students, a gesture he hoped would begin to atone for his past actions. Ava looked up, her eyes dark and guarded. It's a start, she conceded, her voice measured. The words were not an endorsement, but a small crack in her carefully constructed wall of hurt. He nodded, understanding the depth of her reservations. He'd spent countless hours poring over applications for the foundation, scrutinizing each candidate's profile, each ambition, each carefully crafted essay. It was a chance for him to actively contribute to the very communities he'd subconsciously dismissed. He knew a simple gesture couldn't erase the pain, but he was determined to show the sincerity of his remorse. The scent of the old books seemed to blend with the fragrance of remorse and hope. I know, he said softly. A foundation can't undo what's been done, but I hope it's a way to show how deeply sorry I am. He watched her face closely, searching for any sign of softening, any flicker of forgiveness. The silence hummed between them, charged with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, a heavy cloak he was only just beginning to shed. The journey was long, but the first hesitant steps toward reconciliation were underway. The crisp autumn air, scented with wood smoke and damp earth, seeped through the open window of Ava's study. Sunlight slanted across the polished mahogany desk, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Julian watched her, a silent observer, his heart a tight fist in his chest. He'd brought her a small bouquet of sunflowers, their bright faces a stark contrast to the somber mood that hung heavy in the air. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the quiet room. Ava, he began, his voice a low rumble. I understand if you can't forgive me, but I wanted you to know. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He reached out, placing the sunflowers gently on the desk beside her. Their warmth felt incongruous with the chill that permeated the room. Ava didn't look at the flowers. Her gaze remained fixed on a half-finished sketch, her fingers still tracing the charcoal lines. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. It's not about forgiveness, Julian. It's about understanding. Understanding the depth of your prejudice, the casual cruelty. That's something I'm still struggling with. He nodded, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He saw the hurt etched in the delicate lines of her face, the subtle tremor in her hand. He'd inflicted this pain, this deep-seated wound. The realization struck him with a fresh wave of guilt. It wasn't enough to apologize. He had to actively dismantle the walls he'd built between them, brick by painstaking brick. He picked up one of the sunflowers, its head heavy with its own weight, mirroring the burden on his heart. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't erase the past, But I want you to know I'm trying to be better. For you, for Damon, for myself. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing beyond the pain to the resilient strength that shone through. The quiet determination in her eyes, the same fire he'd once seen in his younger self, fueled a fragile hope. The journey was far from over, but in the quiet shared space, amidst the scent of sunflowers and charcoal, a single seed of trust had been planted. The mahogany table between them felt like a chasm, separating not just physical space but the vast gulf of hurt and misunderstanding. Ava's fingers, slender and elegant, traced the rim of her wine glass, the crystal catching the soft candlelight. The air hummed with unspoken words, thick with the scent of lilies and the lingering residue of their earlier, fraught conversation. Julian watched her, his own hands clenched in his lap, the rough fabric of his trousers a stark contrast to the delicate smoothness of Ava's glass. I know saying sorry isn't enough," he began, his voice rough, the words tumbling out in a rush. The confession hung in the air, heavy and laden with regret. He saw the flicker of something in her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a sliver of acknowledgement. A small crack in the formidable wall she'd erected. Ava finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "It's the actions, Julian," she said, her voice low and controlled, but a tremor betrayed the effort. The constant belittling, the attempts to control. It wasn't just about Damon. It was about me, who I am. He nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He'd underestimated the depth of her pain, the pervasive nature of his prejudice. He'd seen her strength, her resilience, yet he'd still tried to break her, to diminish her. The shame was a physical ache in his chest. He reached across the table, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers before gently covering it. The warmth of her skin seeped through, a jolt of connection that transcended words. "I'm trying to understand," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "To truly see you, not through the lens of my own biases, but as my daughter." The confession felt raw, vulnerable, yet profoundly necessary. Ava's gaze softened, ever so slightly. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and for the first time since the revelation, Julian saw a glimmer of hope. The journey ahead remained long and arduous, fraught with challenges. Yet in this shared silence, in the quiet intimacy of a hand gently clasped over another, the first hesitant steps toward healing were taken. The scent of lilies and the warmth of her touch offered a fragile promise of a future rebuilt on truth, understanding, and the profound bond of father and daughter. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ava's penthouse apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The city stretched out below, a glittering tapestry of light and shadow. Ava sat on the balcony, a steaming mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. The scent, usually soothing, did little to calm the turmoil within. Julian's attempts at reconciliation felt clumsy, heartfelt, yet still tinged with the same arrogance that had fueled his initial rejection. She traced the rim of her mug, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill that lingered in her heart. The DNA results had shattered her world, replacing romantic love with a complex, painful reality. She'd seen the genuine remorse in his eyes, heard the tremor in his voice, yet the sting of his past actions still lingered. A soft knock on the sliding glass door. It was Damon. He held a single crimson rose, its velvety petals unfurling like a promise. "He wanted me to give you this," Damon said, his voice low, his eyes searching hers. The gesture felt significant, a fragile bridge in the chasm separating them. Ava took the rose, its fragrance intoxicating. "He's trying, Damon," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The confession felt vulnerable, exposing the cracks in her carefully constructed defenses. Damon sat beside her, the silence comfortable, charged with unspoken emotions. The city lights twinkled, mirroring the uncertainty in her heart. "He's facing his demons, Ava. It's not easy." She nodded, the weight of his words settling on her. Seeing his father confront his own prejudices, his own ignorance, was a testament to the power of love and forgiveness, but it wouldn't erase the pain. The journey to healing wouldn't be linear, wouldn't be easy. But in the quiet embrace of the city night and the warmth of Damon's presence, Ava felt a flicker of hope, a fragile seed of trust beginning to take root. The path ahead was still long, yet perhaps, just perhaps, they could find their way through the darkness, toward a future illuminated by the promise of a restored relationship, founded not on wealth or power, but on the unwavering strength of family. The crisp autumn air bit at Ava's cheeks as she walked through Central Park, the fallen leaves crunching under her heels. The vibrant reds and golds offered a stark contrast to the gray landscape of her emotions. Julian's apology, delivered with genuine remorse, had been a breakthrough, yet a chasm remained. Trust, once shattered, wasn't easily rebuilt. She paused by a quiet pond, watching ducks glide effortlessly across the water. Their serene movements mocked her inner turmoil. She thought of her father's past, the hidden life he'd led, and the pain it had caused. The weight of it pressed down on her, a heavy cloak she couldn't easily shed. Her phone buzzed. It was Damon. "Ava, can we talk? There's something Dad wants to show you." Hesitantly, she agreed to meet him at Julian's penthouse. The opulence felt jarring, a stark reminder of the wealth that had once been a barrier, now a potential bridge. Julian stood by the window, his back to her. The city spread before him like a conquered kingdom. He turned, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Ava," he began, his voice thick with emotion. I found this." He held out a faded photograph, its edges worn and creased. It was a picture of him and a young woman, her face obscured by shadow but her smile familiar. "Your mother," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ava felt a surge of something akin to empathy, a crack in the ice that had encased her heart. She recognized a resemblance in the young woman's eyes, the same strength and determination she saw in herself. Looking at the picture, she understood a part of her father that she'd never known before, a father stripped of his arrogance, vulnerable and exposed. Tears stung her eyes. "I know it's not enough," Julian said, his voice breaking. "But I want you to know. I want to know you." The simple words held the weight of a lifetime of regret. The city lights glimmered outside, reflecting the shimmer of unshed tears in Ava's eyes. The path ahead was still uncertain, but in that moment, a fragile seed of hope took root, promising a future where healing might be possible. The penthouse felt less like a gilded cage and more like a mausoleum, the opulent furnishings heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Ava sat stiffly on a silk chaise lounge, the plush fabric a stark contrast to the rigid posture she maintained. The faint scent of old leather and expensive cigars clung to the air, a reminder of Julian's past self. Damon paced nervously, his usual easy charm replaced by a worried frown. "He wants to show you something from his past," Damon said, his voice low. He avoided her gaze, fiddling with the cuff of his shirt. Julian entered, a hesitant figure in contrast to his usual commanding presence. He held a worn leather-bound photo album, its cover cracked and faded. He offered it to Ava with trembling hands, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and profound regret. Ava hesitated, her fingers brushing the worn leather. Opening the album felt like unearthing a forgotten tomb. The sepia-toned photographs were snapshots of a younger Julian, laughing, carefree, his eyes alight with a passion she'd only glimpsed recently. One photograph caught her breath, a young woman with a radiant smile, her arm around Julian's waist. The resemblance was undeniable. It was a mirror image, reflecting the strength and unwavering spirit she saw in herself. A single tear traced a path down Ava's cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. This is your mother," Julian whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Her name was Isabel." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken years, of secrets and lies, of a father's profound regret and a daughter's long-suppressed longing. Ava studied the picture, a complex tapestry of emotions swirling within her, anger, pain, and a flicker of understanding. She finally spoke, her voice barely a breath. "She looks strong." Julian nodded, his gaze locked on the photo. She was incredibly strong. He swallowed, the lump in his throat visible. "And I was a coward." His voice cracked, the confession raw and painful. The city lights twinkled outside, mirroring the fragile hope beginning to bloom in the shadowed corners of Ava's heart. The path to healing remained arduous, but for the first time, they stood together on the precipice, facing their shared past, ready to perhaps build a future. The penthouse suite, usually a symbol of Julian's untouchable power, felt strangely vulnerable. Sunlight, fractured by the cityscape, painted stripes across the polished floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the otherwise immaculate air. Ava sat by the window, the city a blurred panorama below. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant wail of a siren. Julian watched her, a mixture of hope and trepidation etched on his face. He'd spent a lifetime building walls, but now he felt the fragility of each carefully constructed brick. I understand if you need time," he began, his voice a low rumble, betraying the nervousness he tried to mask. The words felt clumsy, inadequate to express the weight of his guilt. Ava turned, her eyes, usually so bright and full of life, now held a guarded stillness. "Time?" she repeated, the word laced with quiet bitterness. "You think time will erase what you did? The humiliation, the blatant disrespect." Her voice was controlled, but a tremor betrayed the underlying hurt. He winced, the sharp sting of her words a stark reminder of his past actions. "No," he whispered, shame burning in his chest. "But I want to try to make amends, to understand, to be a father." He took a step closer, hesitant, unsure of how to bridge the chasm that separated them. Ava remained motionless, her gaze unwavering. The silence hung between them, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations and the fragile possibility of reconciliation. The scent of lilies, usually a calming presence in the penthouse, now felt cloying, suffocating in its sweetness. The weight of his actions pressed down on Julian, the opulent surroundings suddenly feeling claustrophobic. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, then retracting. The gesture, small in its physicality, felt monumental in its symbolic significance. He had to tread carefully, aware of how easily he could shatter the delicate balance that existed between them. He needed to show, not just say, that he was truly remorseful. He had to earn her trust, not demand it. The journey would be long, but he knew, for the first time, that it was a journey he must undertake. The therapist's office smelled faintly of sandalwood and old books. Julian sat rigidly on the plush couch, the embroidered cushions feeling strangely alien against his tailored suit. He'd spent his life in boardrooms, commanding attention, but here, the silence felt oppressive, the weight of his past actions pressing down. Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a sharp intellect, simply waited, her gaze patient and understanding. "It's difficult," Julian finally admitted, his voice a low rumble. He wrung his hands, the expensive fabric creasing under the pressure. "To admit I was so blinded by my own prejudices. I saw Ava through a lens of my own making, and it distorted everything." Dr. Sharma nodded, her expression encouraging. "And what was that lens, Mr. Thorne?" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "My upbringing, I suppose, a sense of entitlement, a belief in my own superiority, a fear of difference." He looked away, ashamed. The city lights outside blurred through the window pane, a hazy reflection of his own troubled reflection. "I never considered the possibility that my own actions could stem from such deep-seated insecurities." A sigh escaped his lips, a sound heavy with regret. "I treated Ava like she was less than, and she's my daughter, my own flesh and blood." The words hung in the air, raw and painful. The scent of sandalwood did little to mask the bitter taste of his self-reproach. The silence that followed was not oppressive this time, but reflective, a shared space for contemplation. He imagined Ava, her face etched with hurt, her gaze steady, yet burdened. The road to reconciliation was long, arduous. But for the first time, Julian felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile flame against the overwhelming darkness of his past. The journey to self-understanding had begun. He needed to find a way to not just apologize, but to truly understand his actions and take responsibility for his deep-rooted prejudices. He had to become a better man. For Ava, for Damon, for himself. The crisp autumn air bit at Julian's exposed skin as he walked through Central Park, the vibrant foliage a stark contrast to the gray turmoil inside him. He'd spent the last few sessions with Dr. Sharma dissecting his prejudices, a process as painful as surgery. Each revelation, each admission, chipped away at the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart. He stopped at a bench overlooking a shimmering pond, the ducks gliding serenely across the water, a picture of peaceful indifference to his internal struggle. He pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet, a faded image of a laughing young woman with fiery red hair, his college sweetheart, Sarah. The resemblance to Ava was undeniable, a ghost of the past suddenly made brutally real. A wave of guilt, sharp and stinging, washed over him. His phone buzzed. It was Damon. "Dad? Ava's agreed to meet, but she wants to do it at her place, not mine." The hesitance in Damon's voice mirrored his own apprehension. The meeting was tense. Ava's apartment, modern and minimalist, felt cold despite the warm lighting. Ava sat rigidly on a sleek, white sofa, her gaze unwavering. The scent of sandalwood incense, a faint echo of his therapy sessions, hung in the air, a fragile bridge between their fractured worlds. "I understand an apology isn't enough," Julian began, his voice barely above a whisper, each word a carefully chosen stone laid upon the path to reconciliation. "But I need you to know the depth of my regret. I behaved abominably, fueled by ignorance and fear." Ava's expression remained unchanged, a mask of controlled emotion. "Abominably is an understatement, Father. You tried to buy me off. You sabotaged my career. You humiliated me." Her voice was low, steady, yet the controlled fury radiated from her. He winced. He deserved her anger. "And I hurt you profoundly. I see that now. The truth. Learning you were my daughter. It shattered everything I thought I knew." He paused, his throat thick with unshed tears. "I was a fool, blinded by my own privilege and prejudice." Silence descended, heavy and expectant. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the apartment, marking the slow passage of time, the slow drip, drip, drip of his attempts at redemption. The weight of his past actions was still there, crushing, but for the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope in Ava's eyes, a small crack in the hardened facade. The journey was long, arduous, but he had finally begun to walk it. The therapist's office smelled faintly of lavender and old leather. Julian sat rigidly, the plush armchair offering little comfort. Dr. Sharma's gentle probing was relentless, peeling back layers of ingrained prejudice until raw, exposed nerves throbbed. "The DNA results. They changed everything," Julian confessed, his voice a low rumble. He saw the ghost of Sarah, her laughing face superimposed on Ava's, the similarity striking, heartbreaking. The guilt was a physical weight crushing his chest. "It's a process, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Sharma said softly, her voice a calming counterpoint to the storm raging within him. "Facing your past, accepting responsibility. It takes time." Later, the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window of his penthouse. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling. He dialed Ava's number, each ring a hammer blow against his already fragile resolve. He braced himself for rejection, for the justifiable fury he knew he deserved. "Hello." Ava's voice, cool and measured, sent a chill down his spine. "Ava, it's me. Julian." He began, his voice a strained whisper. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, before she spoke, her tone laced with a quiet but unmistakable pain. "I don't want to talk to you, Father. The click of the disconnected line echoed the shattering of his hope. He stared at the phone, the cold plastic a stark reflection of the icy chasm between them. The weight of his actions pressed down, heavy and unforgiving. Yet, a stubborn ember of hope, flickering weakly, remained. He wouldn't give up. Not yet. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's trembling hands. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering tapestry of indifference. He'd spent hours staring at the cityscape, the relentless hum of the city a counterpoint to the storm raging within. Each skyscraper felt like a monument to his arrogance, his past mistakes looming larger than life. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking a fragile melody against the silence. The scent of old leather and expensive bourbon couldn't mask the bitter taste of regret. He reread Ava's email, the words stinging like acid. Her rejection wasn't just a refusal to speak. It was a rejection of him, of everything he represented. The crispness of the digital message contrasted sharply with the chaotic turmoil in his soul. He needed to understand, to reach beyond the anger and hurt. A knock echoed through the vast office, shattering the silence. Damon entered, his face etched with concern. "Dad," he began, his voice hushed. "I talked to Ava." Julian's heart plummeted. "And?" he managed, his voice barely a whisper. Damon hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's hurting, Dad. Deeply. But she said she needs time. She wants to understand why you acted the way you did. Not just accept an apology." The weight of that statement pressed down on Julian, crushing him under its truth. He knew apologies weren't enough. He needed to excavate the roots of his prejudice, to understand the deep-seated insecurities that fueled his actions. He needed to expose the ugliness, to bring it into the light. "Time," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "It's what I need to earn her forgiveness." Damon nodded, his expression softening. "I know you can, Dad. She sees a glimmer of change in you." He paused. "But she's afraid it's not real. Afraid it's just another manipulation." The truth of Damon's words struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He had to show Ava, not tell her. He had to demonstrate the sincerity of his remorse through consistent action, through sustained effort. The road to redemption was long and arduous, filled with self-reflection and difficult confrontations. But for the first time, Julian felt a sliver of genuine hope. A fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. The city lights, once symbols of his detached power, now seemed to glimmer with the possibility of reconciliation, with the chance for a future built on something more meaningful than wealth and power. He would fight for his daughter, for the family he almost destroyed. The journey was far from over, but the first step had been taken. The crisp autumn air bit at Julian's cheeks as he walked through Central Park. The crunch of fallen leaves a stark contrast to the polished marble floors of his office. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. The weight of his actions pressed down, a physical burden he carried with every breath. He'd spent the morning making amends with Mr. Henderson, the CEO of the firm he'd subtly sabotaged Ava's promotion at. The apology had been difficult, the shame palpable. Henderson, surprisingly understanding, had spoken of seeing a change in him, a genuine remorse he hadn't witnessed before. A robin perched on a bare branch, its bright red breast a splash of color against the muted tones of the park. Julian watched it, a small flicker of peace settling in his chest. Small victories. He needed to focus on those, on the small steps forward. His phone buzzed. It was Damon. "Dad, I'm at the gallery. Ava's here. She wants to talk." His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt the familiar tremor of fear, the icy grip of anxiety. He arrived at the gallery, a haven of modern art starkly contrasting with the turmoil in his soul. Ava stood by a vibrant abstract painting, her back to him, her shoulders slightly slumped. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. He approached cautiously. "Ava," he began, his voice raspy with unshed tears. She turned. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and wit, were clouded with a deep sadness. "Julian," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I I know I hurt you, more than words can say. He stammered, feeling the inadequacy of his words. He wanted to explain, to unravel the tangled threads of his prejudice, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Ava met his gaze, her expression unreadable. The money, Julian. The blatant disrespect. It's not something easily forgotten. He nodded, shame washing over him. I know, and I understand if you can't forgive me, but I want you to know, I'm trying. I'm fighting against the man I was. A long silence hung between them, the only sound the hushed whispers of other gallery visitors. Then, Ava took a deep breath. The DNA test. It changed everything. It explained so much. But it doesn't excuse anything. She looked at him, a flicker of something, hope, forgiveness, in her eyes. It's a start, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A fragile start, but a start nonetheless. The weight on Julian's chest lightened, ever so slightly. The road ahead was long, but for the first time he felt a genuine possibility of healing. The gallery hummed with hushed conversations and the soft clink of champagne flutes, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Julian. Ava's words, a fragile start, echoed in his ears. He watched her, mesmerized by the subtle shift in her expression. A softening around the edges, a hint of something akin to compassion. The scent of lilies, their sweetness cloying in the air, did little to mask the underlying tension. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently touched her arm. The contact sent a jolt through him, a raw electric connection that transcended the hurt and the anger. Ava, he began again, his voice hoarse. Let me show you. Let me show you I'm not that man anymore. Ava didn't pull away. She didn't speak. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, her gaze searching, assessing. The silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken emotions. The vibrant colors of the abstract painting seemed to blur, their intensity mirroring the turmoil in Julian's soul. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. Show me, Julian. Show me you understand the depth of what you did. Show me you're not just saying the words, but truly feeling the weight of them. He nodded, his throat thick with emotion. The weight of his past actions pressed down, heavier than ever before. He knew this wasn't a quick fix, a simple apology that would erase everything. This was the beginning of a long, arduous journey, a slow, painstaking reconstruction of trust. He had to prove himself not just to Ava, but to himself. The quiet determination that flickered in Ava's eyes gave him a sliver of hope, a fragile, precious thing he wouldn't dare to crush. He took another step towards her, into the heart of the storm, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The path to redemption was paved with humility, and he was ready to walk it. The following weeks were a blur of carefully chosen words and hesitant gestures. Julian, accustomed to commanding boardrooms, found himself stumbling over apologies, his usual eloquence replaced by a raw vulnerability. He started attending therapy, the sterile office a stark contrast to the opulence of his penthouse. The therapist's gentle probing unearthed layers of ingrained prejudice, revealing the fragile foundation upon which his success was built. One evening, sitting across from Ava in a quiet, dimly lit Italian restaurant, the aroma of rosemary and garlic doing little to soothe the tension, he confessed, I didn't just hurt you, Ava. I hurt a part of myself I never knew existed. Ava, her gaze intense, met his. I understand the hurt, Father, she said, her voice low and steady. But understanding doesn't erase it. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of glasses from other tables. He watched her sip her wine, the red liquid catching the light, reflecting the fire in her eyes. It was a fire that both frightened and captivated him. He saw a strength there, a resilience forged in the crucible of his own cruelty, a strength that mirrored his own buried potential for empathy. He saw a daughter. He realized that acceptance wouldn't be a sudden blooming flower, but the slow, painstaking growth of trust amidst the weeds of his past actions. The path ahead remained daunting, yet the glimmer of hope, fragile as it was, kept him going. He knew the work was only beginning. His journey toward redemption had just begun. The healing, however, was a process that required patience, understanding, and a profound willingness to confront not just his actions, but the deep-seated beliefs that fueled them. The mahogany boardroom, usually a stage for Julian's power plays, felt suffocatingly small. He sat across from Mr. Henderson, the CEO of a rival firm, the air thick with the scent of old leather and unspoken accusations. Henderson, a man Julian had once effortlessly manipulated, now regarded him with a mixture of pity and disdain. The Thorne Foundation's recent donations, "They're admirable, Julian," Henderson said, his voice carefully neutral. "But they don't quite erase the incident with Ms. Hayes." The words hung heavy, a stark reminder of the professional damage Julian had inflicted. Julian felt a familiar tremor of unease. He'd underestimated the ripples of his actions. The quiet apology he'd offered felt inadequate, a pathetic whisper against the roar of his past behavior. "I understand your reservations, Mr. Henderson," Julian replied, his voice low and measured, a stark contrast to his usual booming pronouncements. He felt the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. "I'm working to rectify the situation, to rebuild trust." He paused, searching for the right words that wouldn't sound like the hollow pronouncements he'd become accustomed to making. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against his carefully constructed image. He looked out the window, the city skyline a dizzying spectacle of glass and steel, a reflection of the ambition that had once consumed him. Now, the view felt less triumphant and more like a stark reminder of his own failings. Henderson's gaze softened slightly. "It's a long road, Julian," he conceded, "but I suppose second chances are possible." The unspoken caveat hung in the air, a testament to the fact that true redemption was a slow and arduous process. The meeting ended with a carefully negotiated agreement. The weight of his past actions and the hard work ahead pressed upon him, heavy as a lead cloak. Yet within that weight, a new strength was growing. The strength of responsibility, the strength of true remorse. He would continue to work not just to repair the damage, but to become the man he should have always been. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sprawling Thorne estate. Inside, Julian sat alone in his study, the scent of old books and leather a familiar comfort. He'd spent the afternoon poring over old photographs, his fingers tracing the faded image of a younger, carefree him with a woman whose resemblance to Ava was undeniable. The guilt gnawed at him, a persistent ache in his chest. He picked up a framed picture of Damon and Ava, their smiles radiant, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his own heart. He felt a pang of regret so profound it almost stole his breath. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Ava's contact. He knew he had to apologize again, more completely this time. He had to let her know the depth of his shame, the gravity of his mistakes. He typed and deleted, retyped and deleted. Words felt inadequate, hollow echoes of the genuine remorse he felt. He finally settled on a simple text. "Ava, can we talk? I need to see you." The response came swiftly. "I'll be at the park tomorrow at noon." The brevity cut him deeper than any rejection. The next day, the park was a tapestry of muted autumn colors. Ava sat on a bench, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the fallen leaves. Julian approached, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He saw the faint line of unshed tears on her cheeks. "Ava," he began, his voice a raspy whisper. He didn't know where to start. I am so sorry." Ava didn't look at him. "Sorry doesn't fix things, Dad." The word Dad hung in the air, fragile and newly formed. The ice in her voice chipped away at his resolve. "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to understand what I did, why I did it." He hesitated, his eyes welling up. "It was born out of my own insecurities, my own prejudices. It wasn't about you, Ava. It was about me." He saw a flicker of something in Ava's eyes. Curiosity, perhaps? A sliver of hope pierced the weight of his guilt. He knew the path to forgiveness was long and arduous, but the first step, the admission of his wrongdoing, felt like a monumental victory. He wasn't just apologizing for his actions. He was apologizing for the man he had been, the man he was determined to never be again. The crisp autumn air nipped at Julian's cheeks as he sat across from Ava at a small, secluded table in a cafe overlooking Central Park. The scent of roasted coffee beans mingled with the earthy aroma of fallen leaves. Ava's hands, usually so graceful and assured, fidgeted with her untouched latte. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved pain. Julian cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet space. "Ava," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I know apologies are cheap, and words can't erase what I did." He paused, searching for the right words, the right tone. He felt the weight of his past actions pressing down on him, a crushing burden. Ava's gaze remained fixed on her steaming cup. "It's more than just the money, Dad," she finally said, her voice low and even, but tinged with a deep weariness. "It was the disdain. The way you looked at me, like I was something less." A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the fine lines around her eyes. Julian winced, the memory of his own prejudiced behavior a sharp stab of guilt. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers before he quickly withdrew it, unsure of her reaction. "I was a fool, Ava. A blind, arrogant fool. My insecurities made me project my own flaws onto you." He felt the tremor of unshed tears behind his own eyes. "I saw your success, your confidence, and instead of admiring it, I feared it." Ava finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something that might have been understanding. "It's a heavy thing to carry, knowing your father looked down on you, dismissed you, because of the color of your skin." Her voice was quiet, but her words resonated with power. Julian nodded slowly, the gravity of her statement sinking in. He didn't try to defend himself. There was no defense. He had been wrong, profoundly wrong, and all the wealth and power in the world couldn't erase that. He had to do more than say he was sorry. He had to show her. He had to show the world. The path to redemption was long and arduous, but he was ready to walk it, one painful step at a time. The weight of his guilt remained, but it was now coupled with a new determination. A determination to rebuild the fractured relationship with the daughter he had so carelessly rejected. The therapist's office smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Julian sat rigidly, his expensive suit feeling like a suffocating weight. He'd spent the last few sessions avoiding eye contact, his gaze fixed on the worn Persian rug. Today, however, he met Dr. Anya Sharma's gaze directly. Her eyes, kind but perceptive, held a depth that unnerved him. "The anger," Dr. Sharma began gently, "it's understandable, but the root of it, that's what we need to uncover." Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat thick with unshed tears. It's the fear," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Fear of losing control. Fear of being seen as less than." He recounted his college years, the casual racism, the subtle slights that had hardened his heart. He spoke of his father, a man who valued success above all else, a man who instilled in him the belief that weakness was unforgivable. The words poured out, a torrent of long-buried shame and regret. He spoke of Ava, of the agonizing realization, the crushing weight of his own hypocrisy. "I built walls, doctor," he confessed, his voice breaking, "walls around my heart, my soul, and I trapped myself inside." He ran a hand through his silvering hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Dr. Sharma nodded slowly. "And now," she said softly, "you're dismantling those walls, brick by painful brick." Her words were a balm, a small comfort in the vast landscape of his remorse. He looked out the window, watching the city unfold below, a cityscape that mirrored the intricate, chaotic landscape of his own soul. He realized the journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark amidst the ashes of his past mistakes. The path to redemption was arduous, but he was finally ready to walk it. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, rich and dark, hung in the air of Ava's penthouse apartment, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of Julian's therapist's office. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the vibrant cityscape below. Ava, perched on a plush velvet armchair, watched Julian pace nervously. He looked smaller, somehow stripped of the arrogant swagger that had once been his trademark. I don't know what to say," he finally mumbled, his voice rough with emotion. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture familiar and revealing of his inner turmoil. Ava met his gaze, her expression a careful blend of hurt and cautious hope. "Say you understand," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Say you understand the pain you caused." He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. "I do. I understand. The money, the attempts to sabotage your career. It was all born out of fear, a fear so deep-seated, so ingrained, I didn't even recognize it." He paused, taking a deep breath. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. The city lights twinkled outside, a silent witness to their fragile reconciliation. "Fear of what?" Ava asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Fear of losing control, of losing my position, my power, and of you." His voice cracked. "Of facing the truth about myself." He looked at her directly, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "Of admitting I was wrong." A tear escaped Ava's eye, a single pearl tracing a path down her cheek. It was a tear of pain, yes, but also a tear of understanding, of the dawning realization that Julian, despite his flaws, was capable of remorse. The city lights blurred slightly as another tear followed, and then another. The weight of their shared history pressed down on them, a heavy blanket woven from years of misunderstanding and prejudice. But beneath the weight, a fragile hope began to bloom. A hope for healing, for forgiveness, for a future built on truth and a newfound understanding. Of remorse, slightly as another tear followed, and then their shared history pressed down on them, years of misunderstanding. Beneath the weight, a fragile hope began to bloom, a hope for healing, for forgiveness, newfound understanding. Slightly as another tear, their shared history pressed down on them, beneath the weight, a fragile hope began to bloom, a hope for healing, for forgiveness, newfound understanding. Slightly as another tear, their shared history pressed down on them, beneath the weight, to bloom, a hope for healing, for forgiveness, to bloom, a hope for healing, for forgiveness, to bloom, a hope for a hope for